When war began in September 1939, Britain depended on roughly 1 million tons of imported food, oil, and raw materials every week. Grain from North America, oil from the Caribbean, steel components from across the empire, all moved in convoys across thousands of miles of exposed ocean. If sinkings exceeded construction, factories would stall, civilian rations would shrink, and military production would erode. That was the calculation behind the German submarine campaign. Germany entered the war with fewer than 60 operational ocean-going submarines. Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz argued that at least 300 were required to fracture Britain's supply system. A standard Type 7 U-boat displaced roughly 700 to 1,000 tons, carried 14 torpedoes, and mounted a deck gun, firing shells weighing around 20 pounds. Each torpedo weighed over 3,000 pounds, and carried a warhead capable of ripping open hull plates of merchant ships, displacing 10,000 tons or more. Early in the war, Wolfpack tactics collided with poorly protected convoys. A single submarine would shadow a convoy at night on the surface, transmitting coordinates by encrypted radio. Other boats converged, forming a loose perimeter measured in miles. Attacks followed after dusk. Torpedoes struck tankers carrying thousands of barrels of fuel. Freighters loaded with grain burned from bow to stern. In 1942 alone, German submarines sank over 6 million tons of Allied shipping. Inside a submerged U-boat at 100 feet, electric motors hummed while battery gauges ticked downward. Condensation dripped from pipes. When depth charges detonated nearby, each charge containing hundreds of pounds of explosives, the hull flexed under pressure. Bolts strained. Crewmen stood motionless, counting seconds between blasts to estimate how close the escort ships had come. Yet the Atlantic War did not remain static. Allied shipyards began launching Liberty ships at a rate measured in the thousands over the course of the conflict. Some were constructed in under 2 months. Escort vessels multiplied. Radar sets detected surfaced submarines at night. Aircraft extended patrol coverage into mid-ocean gaps where U-boats once roamed with relative freedom. When I once cross-referenced monthly submarine loss reports with Allied convoy construction data from mid-1943, the reversal became stark. In May of that year alone, Germany lost over 40 submarines. Crew casualty rates by war's end exceeded 60%. Of approximately 40,000 German submariners who served, over 30,000 died. The ocean that once concealed, now revealed through radar pulses and sonar echoes. Convoy escorts adopted new weapons. Hedgehog mortars launched contact-fused explosives ahead of ships, reducing reliance on depth-charge guesswork. High-frequency direction finding, triangulated radio transmissions used to coordinate Wolfpacks. Each transmission that summoned help also exposed position. Technological adaptation eroded submarine survivability. The strategic contest hardened into industrial endurance. A U-boat on patrol consumed thousands of gallons of diesel fuel and carried provisions for weeks. If it sank 50,000 tons of shipping in a patrol, Allied yards might replace that loss within months. Germany, under sustained bombing, struggled to expand submarine output at equivalent pace. Replacement crews received abbreviated training as losses mounted. For merchant sailors, the war at sea meant long watches, scanning dark horizons for periscopes. It meant lifeboats lowered into water measured in single-digit temperatures after torpedo impact. For submariners, it meant months in confined steel cylinders, where oxygen levels dipped and fresh water was rationed by cupfuls. The Wolfpack campaign reached its peak in early 1943, and then receded under combined air, sea, and intelligence pressure. Submarines introduced snorkels to reduce surfacing vulnerability. Yet by then, Allied air coverage had expanded across most transit routes. The arithmetic had shifted. If you are listening now, perhaps letting the quiet of night settle in, imagine a convoy stretching across a dark Atlantic horizon, engines churning steadily, while beneath the surface, a submarine calculates angle and speed. Then, imagine that same submarine hunted by sonar pings and aircraft engines overhead. The ocean remains vast, but the balance tightens. Let that steady rhythm of waves ease your thoughts. This is the entire history of the U-boat war, Wolfpacks in the Atlantic. Chapter 1. The Unfinished Weapon. The 18th of June, 1935. London. A Tuesday. gray and unremarkable in the way that London Tuesdays tend to be. Somewhere in a Whitehall conference room, British and German naval representatives are signing a treaty, the Anglo-German Naval Agreement, that will, within a decade, contribute to the deaths of roughly 30,000 German sailors and the loss of more than 14 million tons of Allied shipping. The men in that room believe they are containing a threat. They are, in fact, licensing one. There's a particular kind of quiet that precedes catastrophe, not the dramatic silence before a battle, but the bureaucratic hum of a meeting room where people are writing numbers on paper and calling it security. That is what this agreement was. Germany is permitted to build submarine tonnage up to 45% of Royal Navy submarine strength. The British delegation considers this reasonable. In Kiel, a naval officer named Karl Dönitz receives the news and begins calculating how many submarines he would need to strangle Britain's Atlantic supply lines. His answer is 300. His navy will give him 57 when the shooting starts. There is a document in the Bundesarchiv Militärarchiv in Freiburg that I find myself returning to whenever I try to understand how this war was started. It's a procurement file, dated the 17th of March 1936, and it contains a requisition form for the construction of 12 new Type 7 submarine hulls. 2 rubber stamps sit on the page, one approving the order, one crossing out 4 of the 12 due to steel allocation shortfalls. That crossed out number 4 is where this entire story begins. Not in the torpedo tracks across moonlit Atlantic water, not in the depth charge blasts and the breaking hulls, but in a procurement office where someone had to choose between submarines and something else, and chose something else. The Kriegsmarine in 1939 wasn't the hammer Dönitz wanted. It was an instrument still being assembled, handed to a man who had already mapped out the concert he intended to perform with it. The historical record on Germany's pre-war submarine readiness is actually more candid than you might expect, which makes it stranger that the war happened when it did. Dönitz's own Kriegstagebuch, his war diary, the BDUKTB, records his reaction to the declaration of war in September 1939, with language that is, for a senior German naval officer in that moment, remarkably unguarded. He wrote that the war had come 4 to 5 years too early. Not that it was wrong, not that it was unwinnable, simply that the arithmetic didn't work yet. When Britain declared war on Germany on the 3rd of September 1939, the Kriegsmarine had 57 commissioned U-boats. Of those, only 22 were capable of sustained Atlantic operations, and of those 22, only 6 to 8 could be on patrol at any given moment, because the rest were in port for maintenance, resupply, or crew rest. 6 to 8 boats against the entire North Atlantic, against the ocean-going commerce of an island nation of 47 million people. Here is something that gets lost in most accounts of the U-boat war, and it matters more than almost any tactical or technological detail I can give you. The Kriegsmarine's own internal shipyard assessments from 1935 to 1939 showed that even under the ambitious Z-Plan naval expansion program, the projected commissioning rate for new U-boats was roughly 2 boats per month. 2. In a sustained Atlantic campaign against a major naval power, operating at the combat attrition rates that Dönitz's own pre-war exercises predicted, 2 boats per month was not a program of expansion. It was a program of slow replacement. The Type 7C submarine, the workhorse that would carry the great majority of this war's fighting, cost approximately 4 to 5 million Reichsmarks to build, required somewhere between 9 months and a year of construction time, and consumed the labor of several hundred skilled dockyard workers throughout that period. In the first year of the war, the entire steel allocation directed toward U-boat construction amounted to roughly 32,500 tons, representing approximately 29 Type 7 hulls. The remainder went to surface ship construction that would prove, almost without exception, strategically irrelevant. The Type 7 U-boat itself deserves a moment here, because you can't understand the men who fought inside these machines, or the men who fought against them, without understanding what the machine actually was. It was a direct evolutionary descendant of the World War I Type UB-3, an improvement certainly, but not a transformation. Its pressure hull was a cylinder of roughly 4.7 meters internal diameter, fabricated from high-tensile steel at about 18.5 millimeters thickness. Inside this cylinder, between 44 and 52 men would live, fight, and frequently die, for patrols that routinely lasted 60 to 70 days. The two MAN diesel engines, each producing 1,400 horsepower, could drive the boat at 17.7 knots on the surface. Submerged on electric motors, it managed 7.6 knots. On the surface, a Type 7 could barely outrun a destroyer. Submerged, it could not outrun one at all. That speed asymmetry isn't a technical footnote buried in an engineering manual. It is the single physical fact that determines every tactical decision a U-boat commander will ever make, from his first patrol to his last. When I was cross-referencing the pre-war training records with the officer assignment logs, I found something that I think gets to the heart of the institutional culture Dönitz inherited. The U-boat arm, as late as 1937, was considered a backwater posting in the Kriegsmarine. Promotion prospects were poor. Equipment was outdated. The prestigious assignments were in surface fleet commands, the big ships, the prestige billets. Dönitz had to actively recruit officers to submarine service by offering better advancement prospects, and even then the pool of willing volunteers was thinner than he wanted. Several of his most decorated future commanders, men whose names would later appear on post-war memorials and in operational research studies, joined U-boats not out of conviction, but out of career frustration with the surface fleet. It's a detail that complicates the mythology considerably. These weren't ideological warriors who chose the most dangerous branch of service out of fanatical commitment. Many of them were professional naval officers who took an available opportunity and found themselves, through the operation of history, inside one of the most lethal operational environments of the 20th century. The torpedo problem was already visible before the first shot was fired, and I find it persistently astonishing that it wasn't solved sooner. The standard German G7A torpedo, the weapon on which the entire strategic concept of the tonnage war depended, had a depth-keeping mechanism that was tested almost exclusively in the relatively calm, shallow waters of the Baltic Sea. The North Atlantic is not the Baltic. The hydrostatic valve designated T-V, which governed the weapon's depth-running accuracy, was sensitive to assembly tolerances of less than 0.2 of a millimeter. Under the dynamic pressure conditions of open ocean sea states, it failed regularly, sending torpedoes running 10, 15, even 20 meters deeper than commanded, passing cleanly beneath the hulls of ships that should have been struck. This fault was known before the war began. It was flagged in internal testing reports, and it went into combat unresolved because production timelines and bureaucratic momentum had outrun quality control. The aces of the first happy time, the men whose tonnage claims would be celebrated in Kriegsmarine communiques, were in many cases firing expensive, unreliable weapons into the Atlantic and calling the misses near misses. The myth of precision was built, in part, on defective components. The first U-boat lost in the war was U-39, sunk on the 14th of September, 1939, 11 days after the opening of hostilities, by the destroyers HMS Faulkner, HMS Foxhound, and HMS Firedrake. The crew of 43 men was captured and taken aboard the British vessels. Their debriefing reports, held in the British National Archives ADM series, are interesting documents. What comes through in them, and I want to be careful here not to read too much into transcribed interrogations, is a note of surprise. The men had been detected at a range they hadn't anticipated. Their boat's acoustic signature had been picked up by ASDIC equipment that they had, apparently, underestimated. In September 1939, 11 days into the war, a British destroyer had hunted and killed a German submarine using underwater detection technology that the submarine service had not adequately factored into its operational doctrine. The seed of the entire technological war, the arms race between detection and concealment, between the weapon and the countermeasure, was planted in that single engagement, in waters off the Hebrides, before most people had even registered that the war had started. There is a phrase in Dönitz's post-war memoir, 10 Years and 20 Days, published in 1958, that I keep returning to when I try to understand how a man prosecutes a campaign he privately knows is under-resourced. He writes about his calculations in 1939 with a kind of clinical detachment, as though the gap between what he needed and what he had was simply an engineering problem to be worked around, rather than a strategic reality that should have given pause. He had done the arithmetic on Britain's merchant shipping requirements, on the number of boats required to exceed the replacement rate, on the patrol rotations and maintenance cycles, and transit times. He knew the numbers, and the numbers said he needed 300 boats to guarantee results, and he had, at best, 8 on patrol at any given time. To proceed anyway, with documented knowledge of that gap, is either an act of extraordinary faith in the program's eventual expansion, or a decision to begin a campaign in the hope that political circumstances would generate the resources that strategic logic said were required. I think about this often when I read the 1939 entries in the WW2. The war Dönitz wanted hadn't arrived yet. The war that had arrived was making do with what was available. The 6th of September, 1939, 3 days after the declaration of war. In port at Wilhelmshaven, a Type 7 boat sits at its berth in the pre-dawn dark, completing final stores loading before its first Atlantic patrol. The ventilation systems are running, moving diesel-scented air through compartments that smell of grease and fresh provisions, of rubber gaskets and damp steel. The crew is somewhere between 24 and 26 years old on average. The commander is perhaps 4 years older. They have trained in the Baltic. They have not been in the North Atlantic. The standing orders they carry reflect a doctrine built on paper exercises and harbor water simulations. The torpedo in the forward tube has a depth-keeping valve that has never been tested at Atlantic sea states. And somewhere in Freiburg, in a procurement file stamped in 2 different inks, 4 submarine hulls that were needed and not built are recorded in red pencil, crossed out. The boat leaves harbor at 0530 hours, heads northwest, and begins what will become the longest continuous naval campaign of the Second World War. Chapter 2. The Machinery of the Deep. The 14th of October, 1939. The Scapa Flow Anchorage, Orkney. It is 11 minutes past midnight when the first torpedo from U-47 detonates against the hull of HMS Royal Oak. The British battleship, 49,000 tons of warship, veteran of Jutland, moored inside what was considered an impenetrable naval base, begins her death roll in water so cold that survival beyond a few minutes in it is unlikely. 833 men die that night. Gunther Preen brings his boat home. He is celebrated, decorated, photographed outside Dönitz's headquarters. The newsreels show the crew's faces, young men grinning in their leather jackets, squinting in the autumn light. What the newsreels don't show, what they couldn't show and didn't want to, is what the inside of that boat looked like, smelled like, felt like, after 2 nights of running submerged in enemy water, with 50 men sharing the same recycled air. The machinery of heroism runs on something less cinematic than the posters suggest. Most accounts of the U-boat war spend their time on strategy, the tonnage calculations, the convoy battles, the code-breaking, the escort groups. I understand why. That's where the big historical movements are. But when I've spent time working through the Type 7C engineering documentation, and there is a remarkable manual held at the U-boat archive at Altenbrook that I'd recommend to anyone with a technical appetite, what strikes me most forcefully is how the physical reality of the machine shaped everything that happened inside it. You can't separate the tactics from the technology, and you can't separate the human experience from the engineering. The boat determined the war at a level of granularity that gets lost when you're looking at fleet tonnage maps. The pressure hull that housed those 50-odd men was a cylinder of 4.7 meters internal diameter, roughly the width of a large living room, and about 48 meters long from pressure bulkhead to pressure bulkhead. Inside that space, you had the torpedo room up front, where weapons and ratings shared the same floor, the officers' mess, which was approximately the size of a standard bathroom, the control room in the geographic center, the petty officers' quarters, the engine room with its 2 roaring MAN diesels, the electric motor room, and the stern torpedo compartment at the back. Every centimeter was occupied. Every piece of equipment had a man assigned to it and a man who slept beside it. The loading of a single torpedo is worth understanding, because the effort required illuminates something about how these crews operated. The standard G7A torpedo was 7.163 meters long and weighed 1,538 kilograms. Loading one into a forward tube in the confines of a Type 7 required 12 men working in coordinated rotation through a loading hatch that was barely wide enough for the weapon to pass through. The process took approximately 20 minutes per torpedo under good conditions. The G7E electric torpedo, that became increasingly common through the war's middle years, had its own complications. Its propulsion battery was sensitive to water temperature in ways that significantly affected performance. In North Atlantic water temperatures below 10 degrees Celsius, which is to say most of the Atlantic most of the year, the electric torpedo's effective range dropped from 5,000 meters to as little as 3,000. Some commanders learn this through experience rather than through pre-deployment briefings, and the difference between 5,000 meters and 3,000 meters when you're computing an attack approach against an escorted convoy in the dark is not a small operational variable. The diving sequence of a Type 7 under combat conditions deserves at least a paragraph of careful attention, because it's one of those procedures that sounds manageable until you consider what it actually demanded of the crew. From the command of alarm, the crash dive order, to a depth of 30 meters took approximately 25 to 30 seconds for a well-drilled crew. 25 seconds. The sequence involved opening the main ballast tank flood valves, tilting the hydroplanes to maximum dive angle, cutting the diesel engines, and switching to electric motors, all simultaneously, or near enough to simultaneously that the difference was measured in individual heartbeats. The critical moment in this sequence was the switchover from diesel to electric drive. For roughly 4 seconds, the boat had neither propulsion system engaged. 4 seconds when the boat was neutrally powered, diving by gravity and momentum, in a configuration where any mechanical failure could be fatal. A bungled dive in the face of an attacking aircraft during those 4 seconds killed multiple crews during the war. The procedure that looked crisp and precise in harbor training became a different thing at 3 in the morning, in Force 5 seas, with a Sunderland coming in at 250 feet and its crew already aware of where you were. The air inside a submerged Type 7 is one of those subjects that barely appears in the popular literature, and should appear in every serious account of this campaign. The boat's air purification system consisted of Draeger-manufactured CO2 scrubber cartridges, potassium superoxide compound, each lasting roughly 4 hours per cartridge under normal consumption rates, combined with compressed air bottles for emergency oxygen supplementation. Under normal conditions, a Type 7 could stay submerged for about 12 to 18 hours before atmospheric CO2 levels became operationally significant. By 6 hours submerged, the air already tasted metallic and heavy. By 12 hours, headaches were common. By 18 hours, CO2 levels routinely reached 2.5 to 3% by volume. For reference, normal atmospheric CO2 is approximately 0.04%. Cognitive performance begins to degrade measurably at 1.5%. Decision-making under stress is demonstrably impaired at 3%. I have found no evidence that the Kriegsmarine Medical Corps conducted any formal study of this effect on combat crew performance during the war. The men were expected to function. The documentation assumes they did. When I was working through the survivor testimonies collected by the German Naval Archives after the war, I kept encountering a particular phrase that appears across dozens of different accounts, from dozens of different boats and different patrols. Men describing the experience of a sustained depth charge attack would say, in various formulations, that the worst part wasn't the noise, though the noise was extraordinary, described variously as hammer blows on the hull, as a physical compression of the chest, as a sound that bypassed the ear entirely and was felt rather than heard. The worst part, they said consistently, was the waiting between charges, the engines off, the boat at dead stop, water running somewhere in the darkness from a sprung seal or a cracked pipe fitting, and 50 men not moving, not speaking, some of them silently doing the arithmetic of depth and pressure and the structural limits of the boat around them. The Type 7's rated test depth was 150 meters. Its estimated crush depth was somewhere between 200 and 250 meters, depending on which analysis you read. And the post-war metallurgical studies of recovered wreck sections suggest that structural quality varied considerably from yard to yard. Men were gambling their lives on hull welds made under production line pressure, by workers they had never met, in shipyards they had never seen. There was also the question of the depth gauge itself, and I find this detail persistently uncomfortable when I sit with it. The depth gauges aboard Type 7 submarines were mechanical instruments, Borden tube pressure gauges, calibrated at the factory. Under combat conditions, subject to the mechanical shock of depth charge explosions and the steady wear of pressure cycling over multiple deep dives, they drifted. Several well-documented survivor accounts describe commanders uncertain whether their gauge was reading true depth or a figure 10, 20, even 30 meters removed from reality. Herbert Schulze, commanding U-48, recorded in his war diary taking his boat to what the gauge indicated was approximately 280 meters during a depth charge attack in late 1940, which would represent a significant exceedance of the boat's theoretical structural limits. He survived. Either the gauge was misreading, or individual hull construction quality was more variable than the engineering specifications suggested, or both. The uncertainty itself is the point. These men were navigating their own physical survival by instruments they could not fully trust, in a machine they understood technically, but couldn't know intimately until it was under pressure. It may or may not have been designed to withstand. The torpedo room in a frontline Type 7 doubled as a dormitory for between 12 and 14 ratings. This is a fact that you read quickly in a technical manual, and it takes a moment to fully resolve into an image. The forward torpedo space housed 4 torpedo tubes, 2 upper, 2 lower, plus the reserve weapons in their storage cradles along the keel. The ratings assigned to this compartment slept in folding bunks that were physically staggered around the torpedoes, in spaces that required a man to turn sideways to pass. When a torpedo reload was required, all off-duty personnel were required to vacate the compartment to give the loading crew room to work. This meant that a reload at 3 in the morning, not an unusual operational occurrence, required waking men who had been off watch for perhaps 2 hours, moving them through the narrow central passageway into the already crowded control room or petty officer's mess, waiting 20 minutes for the reload to complete, then filing back. The boat operated on 2 rotating watch sections. Sleep was taken in staggered 4-hour intervals. After 2 weeks at sea in North Atlantic conditions, the cumulative sleep deficit was substantial enough to be physiologically measurable. The Kriegsmarine's operational reports don't record this. The medical assessments from POW debriefings do. There is a war correspondence account, drawn from Lothar Gunther Buchheim's notes from his time aboard U-96 in October 1941, notes that were only partially incorporated into his later, more celebrated work, that describes the condition of a Type 7 crew approximately 2 weeks into a patrol, after a sustained period of bad weather and enemy contact. He writes about the smell first, diesel oil, and human bodies, and the particular Swedish decay of food that has been stored in every available space for 2 weeks. He writes about the faces, the eyes sunken, the skin pale in a way that had nothing to do with fear, just the simple physical toll of weeks without natural light, and with insufficient oxygen and inadequate sleep. He writes about the noise, which didn't stop, the diesels when surfaced, the electric motors when submerged, the constant mechanical percussion of a working vessel in heavy seas, transmitted through the hull to every man aboard without interruption, 24 hours a day, patrol after patrol. To me, this account is more revealing than any tactical analysis of the period. The machine was extraordinary. What it cost the men inside it, in the slow arithmetic of physical depletion, is a different kind of reckoning. 2:30 in the morning, somewhere in the North Atlantic, mid-1941, a Type 7 submarine is at periscope depth, running slow on its electric motors, batteries at 60% capacity, air at borderline quality after 14 hours submerged. The commander has been at the attack periscope for an hour. His engineer officer is monitoring 12 separate gauges in the Zentrale, the control room, each of which represents a system that can fail, some of which can kill the boat if it does. The ventilation fan that circulates what passes for fresh air through the sleeping quarters has been producing an irregular bearing noise for 3 days. A small seawater leak around the stern gland is being managed with a cloth stuffed into the fitting, and a rating whose job tonight is to wring that cloth out every 20 minutes. The torpedoes in the forward tubes have G7E electric motors, whose performance at these water temperatures is approximately 60% of rated specification. The depth gauge may or may not be reading true, and somewhere above them, in the black Atlantic, a convoy is passing. The machinery is as ready as it's going to be. The crew is as ready as they're going to be. In the control room, The clock reads 2:30, and nobody speaks. And the electric motors turn, and the boat waits. Chapter 3. Dönitz, the Architect and the Obsessive. The 4th of October 1918. The Mediterranean, somewhere south of the Sicilian coast. A German submarine commander named Karl Dönitz has just lost his boat. UC-25, a mine-laying submarine, has suffered a combination of mechanical failure and crew incapacitation, and is being surrendered to enemy forces. Dönitz is 27 years old. He has been at war for 4 years. He will spend the next 9 months as a prisoner of the British, first at sea and then in a camp. And he will use that time in a way that no one who processes him as a routine prisoner of war would think to monitor. He will study the convoy system that defeated the German submarine campaign of 1917. He will read everything he can access about escort organization, merchant ship routing, the geometry of convoy screens. And he will begin formulating, in notes that he may or may not have preserved, the theoretical framework for a form of submarine warfare that his captors had just used against him, and that he intends, if he ever gets the opportunity, to use against them. There is a debriefing report in the British National Archives, in the ADM series, that records an interview with a captured German submarine officer in October 1918. The interviewing officer was clearly doing his job professionally and thoroughly, but there's a marginal note on the 3rd page that I find remarkable. He describes his subject as obsessed with convoy, and notes that the man had recommended group attack by radio coordination, and had dismissed the surface fleet entirely. He closes the note with a single word: unusual. That word, unusual, is the most precise intelligence assessment anyone ever wrote about Karl Dönitz. Because what the British officer was hearing across a camp table in 1918 was a coherent doctrine that would kill tens of thousands of Allied sailors 25 years later. It was all there: the radio coordination, the group attack, the convoy focus, the surface fleet irrelevance. The British officer filed his report, noted that the subject had unusual fixations, and moved on. Dönitz went home in 1919 and began 20 years of patient, relentless preparation. The interwar period of Dönitz's career is one of those stretches of history that gets compressed, in most accounts, to a sentence or two. He developed Wolfpack doctrine. He advocated for submarines. Hitler didn't listen. The reality is considerably more interesting. Between 1935 and 1939, Dönitz ran a series of tactical exercises at Kiel, using surface torpedo boats posing as submarines, rehearsing what he called Rudeltaktik, Wolfpack tactics. The exercises were methodically designed and carefully recorded. He was testing a specific operational concept. Could a group of submarines, coordinated by radio through a central headquarters, attack a convoy from multiple directions simultaneously and overwhelm the escort screen? His exercises consistently answered yes. They also, with equally consistent clarity, revealed the doctrine's critical vulnerability. It required constant radio communication between the boats and headquarters. Every Wolfpack operation would generate a substantial radio traffic signature, a cloud of transmissions that any sophisticated adversary with direction-finding equipment could detect, locate, and exploit. Dönitz knew this. It's in his exercise reports. He noted the vulnerability and assessed it as manageable. That assessment would prove to be the most consequential misjudgment of the Atlantic War. What the official histories tend to skim over, and what I think matters for understanding Dönitz as a commander rather than as a symbol, is the question of intellectual authorship. Dönitz consistently claimed full ownership of Rudeltaktik. It was his doctrine, his invention, his contribution to naval warfare. The German naval historian Jürgen Rohr established, through careful archival work, that a Korvettenkapitän named Hermann Bauer had developed nearly identical group submarine tactics in theoretical papers filed during 1916, papers that were part of the standard naval literature that any serious submarine officer would have read. Dönitz was certainly aware of Bauer's work. Whether his insistence on sole intellectual authorship reflects genuine belief, career ego, or the slow rewriting of memory that happens to all of us over decades of repetition, is impossible to determine from the surviving record. What it does reveal is a man who needed ownership, not just operational control, but intellectual primacy, over the instrument he commanded. That need would matter later, when the evidence against his doctrine began to accumulate, and the question of whether to adapt or to persist became the most important decision he faced. The Z Plan, Hitler's naval expansion program approved in 1939, promised Dönitz the fleet he needed, eventually. The timeline was 1944 to 1945. Dönitz had been told to expect his 300 boats by mid-decade. What he actually received when war broke out, as we've established, was 57 total, 22 operational, 6 to 8 on patrol at any time. The gap between the promise and the reality, between the 300-boat fleet in the planning documents and the handful of hulls actually at sea, is the foundational fact of the entire campaign. Everything Dönitz did for the next 4.5 years, every tactical adjustment, every operational order, every decision to continue the campaign past the point where the mathematics of survival favored his crews, flows from his decision in September 1939 to proceed with an instrument he knew was insufficient for the task he'd been given. He wrote in his war diary that the war had come too early. He then fought it anyway. And I find myself, every time I read those diary entries, trying to decide whether that represents courage, professional duty, ideological commitment, or something darker, the refusal to accept that the calculation didn't work. The Laconia incident of September 1942 is where the abstract questions about Dönitz's character become concrete and morally unavoidable. U-156, under Werner Hartenstein, torpedoed the British troop ship Laconia in the South Atlantic. The ship carried, among others, Italian prisoners of war, Germany's allies. Hartenstein surfaced to render assistance, broadcast his position in the clear, and requested international help for the survivors, flying a Red Cross flag. While he was conducting rescue operations, an act that, whatever else it was a human response to a human catastrophe, an American B-24 attacked his boat. He survived. Dönitz, upon receiving the report, spent 12 hours before issuing what became known as the Laconia Order, formally directing U-boat commanders not to rescue survivors of any vessel they sank. At Nuremberg, that order was the centerpiece of the war crimes charges against him. He was convicted. He served 10 years, the minimum of his sentence, and died at 89 in 1980. He outlived nearly every Allied admiral who defeated him. The 12 hours of deliberation before the order was signed are documented. The Nuremberg tribunal considered them and found them insufficient mitigation. I think about that 12-hour interval often. It doesn't resolve into a simple moral verdict, but it refuses to resolve into a simple exoneration either. Dönitz's management of information within the command structure is something that doesn't get enough attention in the popular literature, and it bears directly on how the campaign was sustained past its natural strategic endpoint. The BDUKTB, his headquarters war diary, is an extraordinary document, remarkably detailed, remarkably candid by the standards of military record-keeping under an authoritarian regime. His tonnage calculations are there. His patrol deployment numbers are there. His attrition assessments are there. What is notably absent, as the war turns against him in 1943 and beyond, is any formal acknowledgement within the diary that the campaign's strategic premise, that U-boats could sink Allied shipping faster than it was being built, had been definitively falsified by events. The mathematical reality of Black May 1943 is in the numbers of his own diary. The explicit strategic reassessment those numbers demanded isn't written anywhere in the surviving record. Whether he couldn't see it, or wouldn't write it, or chose to manage the information upward into the OKM in a particular way for institutional and political reasons. The record doesn't tell you which of those is true, probably some combination of all three. What I find when I read the personnel records of the early U-boat arm, and this is a detail that consistently fails to make it into the documentary accounts, is that Dönitz built his elite force, at least in part, from men who hadn't been wanted elsewhere. The surface fleet had its prestige billets, its gunnery officers and navigation specialists on the big ships. U-boats were what was available for men whose career trajectories had stalled. The Kretschmers and the Preens and the Shepkas, who became the celebrated aces of the first happy time, weren't selected from the cream of a competitive volunteer pool. They were professional naval officers who took an opportunity that was offered, found themselves aboard submarines, and discovered that their particular combination of technical aptitude, spatial intelligence, risk tolerance, and, in some cases, a quality that might charitably be described as controlled recklessness, made them extraordinarily effective in this specific operational environment. Dönitz recognized what he had. He promoted it, celebrated it, and, as the war deepened, spent it, one boat at a time. The institutional machinery of the Kriegsmarine's submarine service, as Dönitz constructed it, had a particular quality that's worth noting because it shaped everything from the tactical culture to the morale management decisions to the post-war legal proceedings. It was, more than almost any other military institution of that war, a command built around a single personality. Dönitz was not just the operational commander. He was the conceptual author, the tactical trainer, the public face, and the institutional memory of the entire enterprise. When a commander returned from patrol and reported to BDU, he was reporting to the man who had designed the doctrine he'd just executed, who had personally approved his operational orders, and who would be the primary audience for his after-action assessment. That closeness, that intensity of personal investment at the command level, generated extraordinary loyalty in the crews and commanders. It also meant that questioning the doctrine was, in a particular institutional sense, questioning Dönitz himself. And nobody did that out loud, not in writing, not where it would survive the war. The 24th of September, 1942, BDU headquarters at Lorient, France. The teleprinters are running. The patrol reports are coming in from the Atlantic. Tonnage claimed, torpedoes expended, fuel states, crew condition. Somewhere in the building, Dönitz is working through his daily calculation. Boats at sea, boats in transit, boats in refit. Projected availability against known convoy schedules received from the B-Dienst intercept service. The numbers are good this month. The tonnage figures are close to his target threshold. In the Bay of Biscay, boats are departing on schedule. In the fitting yards, the construction program is accelerating. By his own arithmetic, he is close. What the teleprinters are not yet showing him, what won't be visible in any single month's figures, but will become undeniable within 8 months, is that the arithmetic he's optimized his entire career for is already broken. Allied shipbuilding, powered by American industrial capacity that has been running at emergency tempo since December 1941, has already turned the corner. The boats are going out, the tonnage is being logged, and the war is, invisibly, already lost. He works through the night. The teleprinters keep running. Chapter 4. The First Happy Time. Blood in the Water. The 17th of August, 1940. The western approaches to Britain. The cargo ship SS Har Zion is somewhere in the dark Atlantic, running without convoy, without escort, without any protection beyond the hope that the ocean is large enough to hide in. She's carrying general cargo, food, raw materials, the kind of unspectacular freight that keeps an island nation functioning. There's no dramatic intelligence failure here, no tactical blunder. Just a vessel doing what thousands of vessels were doing that summer, crossing an ocean that had become, in the weeks since France fell and the German Navy moved to the Atlantic coast of France, a fundamentally different kind of ocean. She is found. She is sunk. Her crew goes into the water. Whether they all came out of it, the records I've been able to access don't confirm. She is one entry in a ledger of 282 ships sunk in the North Atlantic between July and October of 1940. A ledger that German submariners would later call, with a candor that is itself a kind of historical document, the happy time. The fall of France in June 1940 did something to the geometry of the Atlantic War that even the most pessimistic British Admiralty planner hadn't fully modeled. When Germany acquired the French Atlantic coast, Lorient, Brest, Saint-Nazaire, La Pallice, Bordeaux, U-boat transit times to the North Atlantic operational areas dropped from 4 to 5 days to under 24 hours. That doesn't sound dramatic until you calculate what it means in patrol endurance terms. A Type 7 submarine on a 70-day patrol spent roughly 10 days in transit each way from a German North Sea base. From a French Atlantic port, that transit fell to less than 2 days each way. The arithmetic is simple. Each boat gained roughly 3 to 4 additional patrol days per deployment, translating across the fleet to dozens of additional attack days per month. Nobody in the Admiralty had war-gamed a scenario in which Germany controlled Brest. Nobody had needed to. And in the summer of 1940, the consequences of that planning gap were measured in ships and in the men who went down with them. The German submarine aces of this period have been written about extensively, And I want to be honest about something that the popular accounts don't usually say directly. A significant portion of their celebrated effectiveness was a product of circumstance rather than pure skill. The convoys and the Western approaches during the summer and autumn of 1940 were frequently inadequately escorted, sometimes with only one or two vessels protecting columns of a dozen or more merchantmen. The ASDIC equipment available to those escorts was the Type 123A, which had a detection cone of approximately 30 degrees either side of the attacking ship's bow, and was entirely ineffective against a surfaced vessel. At night, in the North Atlantic, a U-boat commander who chose to attack on the surface, and Otto Kretschmer in U-99 had made this his signature tactic, was operating in an environment where the principal defensive technology his opponents possessed was literally blind to him. He wasn't more skilled than the situation required. He was skilled enough, in conditions that rewarded a particular kind of controlled boldness, against a defense that hadn't yet adapted to what he was doing. The tonnage figures from this period are worth sitting with, not as a celebration of what was achieved, but as a measure of what was failed to be prevented. Between July and October of 1940, 282 Allied ships, totaling approximately 1.5 million tons, were sunk in the North Atlantic. They were sunk, on average, by between 6 and 8 operational U-boats at any given time. That ratio, 6 to 8 submarines accounting for 1.5 million tons of shipping in 4 months, tells you something essential about the state of Allied anti-submarine warfare in the summer of 1940. It tells you that the defensive systems weren't working, not that they'd been overcome by superior technology or innovative tactics, but that they fundamentally weren't deployed, weren't available, or weren't adequate for the task. The escorts were too few, the coverage was too thin, the equipment had limitations that the commanders in the field understood, but that the Admiralty's convoy allocation decisions hadn't yet accommodated. The most famous 3 commanders of the first happy time, Gunther Prien in U-47, Joachim Schepke in U-100, Otto Kretschmer in U-99, have accumulated a mythology in the decades since the war that is worth examining carefully against the actual operational record. Kretschmer's personal doctrine of one torpedo, one ship, produced a hit rate of 69.8% across 116 fired torpedoes, genuinely remarkable given the unreliable depth-keeping mechanisms we've already discussed. His practice of driving inside the convoy escort screen before attacking at point-blank range on the surface wasn't recklessness. It was a calibrated exploitation of a specific technological blind spot in the escort's defensive capability. His war diary from this period reads, as one researcher has put it, almost like a hunting journal, methodical, technical, without the rhetorical flourishes of the propaganda machine that was simultaneously being built around him. The gap between the man in the diary and the man on the newsreel poster is considerable. He wasn't indifferent to the killing, but his diary makes clear that what occupied his professional attention was the engineering of the attack, not its human consequences. There is a document I've returned to more than once while working through this period, a formal Admiralty analysis from August of 1940, partially declassified in the 1970s, that explicitly identifies what it calls the Western Approaches Gap, the area west of roughly 17 degrees west longitude, where no British escort ships regularly operated. The analysis recommends extension of convoy escort coverage to address this gap. The recommendation is approved in committee in October 1940. Full implementation doesn't happen until mid-1941, 8 months. The bureaucratic machinery processed the recommendation, approved it, and then sat with it for 8 months while ships continued to sink in the unprotected zone the analysis had identified. To me, that 8-month delay is as significant as any tactical or technical failure of the first happy time. The Admiralty knew. They had the analysis. They had the recommendation. And the gap persisted for another 8 months because the institutional processes required to act on knowledge operated on their own schedule, regardless of the operational urgency. The end of the first happy time came quickly and without warning, at least from the German perspective. Between the 7th and the 17th of March 1941, 3 of the most successful U-boat commanders of the war were eliminated within a 10-day span by a single British escort group, the 5th Escort Group, operating with a combination of radar and ASDIC that represented a technological and tactical integration the German submarine service hadn't yet confronted at full effectiveness. Gunther Prien and U-47 were lost on the 7th of March. The precise cause is still debated, with some accounts attributing the sinking to HMS Wolverine, and others finding the evidence ambiguous. Joachim Schepke in U-100 was rammed by HMS Vanock on the 17th of March and killed on his bridge. Otto Kretschmer in U-99 surfaced under depth charge attack and, with his boat failing around him, surrendered. The most tonnage-successful individual U-boat commander of the entire war, walking into British captivity with the war barely 18 months old. What's significant about this 10-day sequence isn't the drama of it, though it is genuinely dramatic. What's significant is the mechanism. 3 veteran commanders, in 3 separate engagements, defeated by technology-assisted detection methods that rendered their experience and skill secondary to the question of whether the equipment could find them. The Lloyds of London loss books, the shipping insurance records that catalogued every vessel lost during the war, give you the first happy time in a different register than the tactical and strategic accounts. The entries are dry, administrative, written in the standardized language of insurance documentation. Vessel name, date, cargo description, crew status where known. It's in the cargo descriptions that the reality of what was being lost comes through most directly. Grain, petroleum products, steel, machinery, foodstuffs, military equipment. And occasionally, in entries that stop you when you come across them, passenger manifests. The September of 1940 entry for the city of Benares records cargo as general merchandise and evacuee children. 77 children were among the dead. They appear in the loss books in the same typographic register as the general merchandise. The tonnage calculations that Dönitz was running at BDU didn't have a category for them either. They were, in the arithmetic of the campaign, shipping losses. The administrative distance between that entry and the reality it describes is one of those silences in the historical record that I find myself unable to read past without stopping. The overclaiming problem in the German operational records from this period is something that historians have been working through carefully since the war ended, and it matters for how we understand the strategic picture that Dönitz was working from. The German commanders' tonnage claims, as recorded in their individual boat war diaries and aggregated at BDU, were substantially higher than post-war cross-referencing with Lloyd's records and Admiralty shipping loss assessments confirmed. The discrepancy runs, in some monthly totals, to 15 to 25%. The reasons are multiple: honest estimation error in poor visibility, shared damage credits that were double counted, the chronic optimism that attaches to the reporting of one's own professional performance under combat conditions. What it means is that the tonnage war Dönitz believed he was winning in the autumn of 1940 was, by a margin of perhaps 200,000 tons in aggregate over claimed figures, somewhat less won than his own records suggested. He was making strategic decisions based on a picture of his campaign's effectiveness that was, consistently, more favorable than reality. Nobody in the intelligence chain was correcting for this. The stars were out over the North Atlantic on the morning of the 17th of March, 1941. Somewhere in the water, the wreckage of 3 German submarines was settling toward the bottom. Otto Kretschmer was aboard a British warship, dry and alive, watching the distance close towards Scotland. In the weeks that followed, Dönitz would receive reports, file assessments, adjust his patrol assignments, and continue the campaign. The boats were still going out. The tonnage was still being accumulated. The war diary at BDU continued its meticulous record of ships sunk and boats expended. But something had been demonstrated in those 10 days in March that couldn't be undone by any tactical adjustment or any deployment order. A British escort group with the right equipment and the right training had found 3 of the best submarine commanders alive, and killed or captured all 3 of them. Not through luck, through method. The first happy time was over, not because Germany had run out of good commanders, but because Britain had finally started to become competent at destroying them. Chapter 5. The Tonnage Ledger. The 7th of November, 1942, Liverpool. The Western Approaches Command Headquarters occupies a converted building that smells of coal smoke and damp paper. the particular atmospheric blend of a British administrative institution operating at full stretch in its third year of war. In an office somewhere in that building, a statistician, probably a civilian, probably working under some deliberately unmemorable job title, is completing a weekly summary sheet of Allied import projections. The document is typewritten. The bottom line figure, total projected imports for the calendar year, has been circled in red. The circle is drawn with the kind of pressure that suggests someone has reached for emphasis at the moment a number resolved from worrying into alarming. The projected figure is 23.1 million tons. Britain's economists had calculated that the minimum for national survival, for the functioning of the war economy, for adequate civilian nutrition, for the fuel supply required to keep the industrial base running, was 26 million tons. The difference is not a statistic. The difference is the gap between an island that can continue the war and an island that cannot. I want to spend this chapter on the arithmetic of the Atlantic War, because I think the arithmetic is more honest than the tactical narrative, and more revealing than the strategic summary. The Battle of the Atlantic is most often described in terms of its major convoy battles, the dramatic encounters, the Wolfpack attacks, the escort group responses. Those narratives are important, and we'll return to them. But they can obscure the underlying calculation that the entire campaign was actually about. Could Germany sink Allied ships faster than Allied and American shipyards could replace them? That was the war. Not the heroism on either side, not the technological competition, not even the code-breaking, though all of those mattered. The war was an arithmetic problem, and understanding who was winning it in any given month required not a tactical assessment, but a comparison of two ledger columns. Shipping lost versus shipping built. For most of 1942, those two columns were running in Germany's favor. Allied ship construction at the war's outset, in 1939, ran at roughly 400,000 tons of new merchant tonnage per month globally. That sounds substantial. In 1942, German U-boats were sinking an average of 650,000 tons per month. The arithmetic of that gap is not complicated, but its implications are staggering. Every month that the sinking rate exceeded the construction rate, the total tonnage available to the Allied war effort shrank. The gap wasn't being closed, it was being widened. Britain in particular was dependent on imported food, fuel, and raw materials in quantities that the domestic production base had no capacity to substitute. By late 1942, rationing was reducing civilian calorie intake measurably, week on week. Industrial output was constrained by fuel shortages. The war economy was running lean in ways that didn't produce dramatic headline events, but showed up, persistently and undeniably, in the kind of administrative documents that historians spend years reading: the import summaries, the fuel allocation reports, the Food Ministry consumption analyses. The American industrial transformation that began in earnest after Pearl Harbor is one of those developments that is simultaneously well known and insufficiently understood in its specific operational dimensions. The Emergency Shipbuilding Program, the Liberty Ship Initiative, applied assembly line prefabrication principles to merchant vessel construction in a way that had no precedent in peacetime shipbuilding. Under Henry Kaiser's yards, a Liberty ship that had taken 355 days to build before the war was being produced, by late 1942, in an average of around 42 hours of final assembly time, because the components had been manufactured simultaneously at multiple inland facilities and transported to the shipways for rapid integration. Each Liberty ship displaced 14,245 tons fully loaded. Each required approximately 250,000 man-hours of combined labor across all production stages. By 1943, American yards were launching roughly 3 Liberty ships every 4 days. The arithmetic that had been running against the Allies through most of 1942 was turning. The turn wasn't dramatic. It was a quarterly ledger adjustment, but it was irreversible. The tanker problem sits in a particular part of the logistics picture that doesn't get enough attention, and it illustrates how the tonnage war had specific consequences that reached far beyond the ocean itself. Petroleum products, fuel oil, aviation gasoline, diesel, were both the most critical import category and the cargo that made individual tankers the highest value targets for U-boat commanders. The Caribbean and Gulf of Mexico tanker routes, exploited during Operation Paukenschlag, and its extensions through the first half of 1942, accounts for a disproportionate share of the period's worst tonnage losses. The knock-on effects of those losses ran through the Allied war economy in ways that weren't immediately obvious from the convoy loss reports. By mid-1942, petroleum shortfalls were affecting aviation fuel availability at U.S. Army Air Force's training bases in the American South. Trainee pilots were having their flight hours reduced because the tankers that should have been delivering the fuel for those hours were on the bottom of the Gulf of Mexico. The U-boat campaign in the Caribbean was shaping the training pipeline for the pilots who would eventually fly anti-submarine patrols against U-boats in the mid-Atlantic. The connections in the logistics web were exactly that circular, and exactly that consequential. When I was cross-referencing the American shipbuilding production tables against the monthly U-boat sinking rates, I noticed something that rarely makes it into the standard narrative of how the tonnage war turned. The crossover point, the month when Allied new construction first exceeded Allied shipping losses, wasn't in 1943, after the tactical victories of Black May. It happened, if the figures I was working from are reasonably accurate, sometime in late 1942. The tactical victories of May 1943 were real and decisive, but the industrial crossover, the point at which it became structurally impossible for Germany to win the tonnage war, regardless of tactical results, had already happened months earlier, quietly, in the production figures of American shipyards. Dönitz's campaign had already lost its strategic rationale before the escort groups and the aircraft finished demonstrating it operationally. The ledger had turned. The battle continued anyway. The British Ministry of War Transport-Import summaries from the second half of 1942 are documents that I find genuinely difficult to read. Not because they're dramatic. They're the opposite of dramatic. They're deliberately understated, written in the precise measured register of civil service administration, but because of what the numbers represent. Churchill's scientific advisor, Frederick Lindemann, Lord Cherwell, prepared fortnightly summaries for the War Cabinet throughout this period, tracking import rates against calculated minimums. Those summaries, working through the CAB files in the National Archives, show imports running 15 to 20% below the calculated survival threshold for months at a stretch. They show the specific commodity categories where shortfalls were most acute. They show, in the aggregate, a national economy being slowly compressed by a campaign fought 3,000 kilometers away, in water so cold that the men who fell into it measured their survival in minutes. The War Cabinet received these summaries, read them, noted them. The war continued, the convoys continued, the escorts continued, the U-boats continued, and the gap between 23.1 and 26 persisted. The per-boat productivity statistics from the Atlantic War, looked at across the whole campaign, tell a story that has significant implications for how we understand German strategy. In the late summer and autumn of 1942, U-boats were achieving tonnage sinking rates of approximately 15,000 to 20,000 tons per boat per patrol in certain operational areas, particularly the American coastal and Caribbean routes. That was anomalously high. The wartime average across all patrols was roughly 4,000 tons per boat per patrol. The gap between the peak productivity of the best operational periods and the average productivity of the campaign as a whole reflects the importance of conditions, of defensive preparedness, of convoy organization, of escort availability, over the technical capability of the submarines themselves. The boats didn't get better or worse through the war in any fundamental sense. What changed was the environment in which they operated. And as the environment hardened, as the escorts improved, as the technology advanced, as the air coverage expanded, the per-boat productivity figures declined in a way that can be tracked almost month by month in the aggregate loss data. The Liberty ship deserves one more paragraph, because its role in the tonnage war was not just quantitative but qualitative, in a way that changed the nature of the campaign. The prefabricated hull sections of a Liberty ship were manufactured at inland factories by workers who had no previous shipbuilding experience. Women recently moved from domestic employment, men from unrelated manufacturing backgrounds, trained in specific assembly tasks over periods of weeks rather than the years that traditional shipbuilding apprenticeships required. The critical innovation wasn't the welding technology, though that mattered. It was the reduction of the shipbuilding process from a unified craft, requiring broadly skilled workers, to a modular assembly sequence that could be performed by narrowly trained specialists working in parallel. This meant that American shipbuilding capacity was effectively unlimited by the traditional constraint, the availability of experienced workers, and limited only by raw material supply and yard space, both of which the American industrial mobilization was expanding rapidly. When the Germans calculated that Allied shipyards could replace roughly 700,000 tons per month in 1941, they were projecting forward from a pre-American mobilization production curve. By 1943, the actual replacement rate had more than doubled. The baseline that the entire tonnage war strategy rested on had shifted under their calculations while they were fighting. The summer of 1942, in retrospect, was the high water mark. The boats were achieving extraordinary results. The tonnage figures coming into BDU from the Atlantic operational zones were, by the numbers that Dönitz had set as his targets, as close to decisive as the campaign would ever come. In November of that year, in a month that would produce the single highest Allied shipping loss total of the entire war, 729,160 tons, the arithmetic looked, from the German side of the ledger, almost winning. And yet, in American yards, Liberty ships were being assembled every 42 hours. In Washington, the administrative machinery of the emergency shipbuilding program was running its own arithmetic, on its own schedule, in response to its own imperatives. Two sets of ledgers, two different tallies, converging toward an answer that the tonnage figures from any single month couldn't yet show. The gap between 23.1 and 26 million tons was real, and it was alarming, and the people staring at it in Liverpool knew it. But the curve had already turned. The red circle on the import summary was, for the last time, that alarming. Chapter 6. Drumbeat, America's Blind Coast. The night of the 13th of January, 1942, 30 miles off the coast of Cape Cod, Massachusetts, a German submarine designated U-123, commanded by Reinhard Hartigan, is running on the surface in the dark. The boat has been at sea for roughly 2 weeks, having departed from Lorient on the 23rd of December. Its crew is rested, relative to what they'll be in a month. Its torpedoes are full, and before it, visible on the horizon as a glow of warm light against the January sky, is New York City. The coastal blackout that wartime Britain had implemented in September 1939, the measures that had reduced British coastal communities to navigating by shaded torchlight, had not been adopted by the American seaboard. The hotels of Miami and Atlantic City were lit, the boardwalk amusements were operating. The freighters and tankers running the East Coast shipping lanes were silhouetted, in the dark of a winter Atlantic, against the lit skyline of the wealthiest coastal corridor in the world. Hartigan, looking at this from his conning tower, reportedly described what he saw as a peacetime scene. It was. America didn't know yet what the Atlantic had already become. Dönitz had been requesting permission for a large-scale operation against American coastal waters since before Pearl Harbor. The potential had been obvious to him for years. American coastal defenses were negligible, convoy escort infrastructure was non-existent, and the shipping lanes running between the oil ports of the Gulf of Mexico and the industrial ports of the northeastern seaboard were among the most heavily trafficked in the world. When the United States entered the war in December of 1941, the bureaucratic constraint on attacking American shipping dissolved. What remained was a practical constraint. Dönitz had more requests for U-boats than boats available, and Hitler had been diverting submarines to the Norwegian coast and the Mediterranean against Dönitz's explicit operational preferences. For the initial Operation Paukenschlag, Dönitz received permission to deploy 5 Type 9 long-range submarines, not 50, not 20, 5, against the entire eastern seaboard of the United States, from Maine to Florida. The results were so disproportionate to the investment that the operational records, when you read them, have a quality of almost absurd imbalance. The Type 9 was a larger, longer-ranged boat than the standard Type 7, approximately 1,050 tons surface displacement versus 769 for the VIIC, with a surface range of roughly 12,000 nautical miles at 10 knots, compared to the 7's 8,500. Its fuel capacity ran to 208 tons of diesel, compared to 113.5 for the VIIC. This meant a Type 9 could operate off the American coast for up to 30 days without resupply, long enough to work a patrol area thoroughly, to learn the shipping patterns, to select targets at the point of maximum vulnerability. The 5 boats of the initial Paukenschlag deployment found an operational environment that matched every theoretical model Dönitz had developed over 2 decades. Well-lit coasts, no convoy system, no effective air patrols, no coordinated naval response. Hartigan's war diary from the first 2 weeks of his American patrol reads like a master craftsman's notes on an unchallenging job. Methodical, professional, without drama, because there wasn't much drama to record. The targets were there, the defensive response wasn't. The coastal lighting situation along the American seaboard in January and February of 1942 is one of those historical facts that sounds almost impossible to credit until you examine the documentation, and then it becomes one of the most frustrating records of the war. American municipalities had been formally advised of the potential threat from submarine operations. The British had been operating full coastal blackouts since the autumn of 1939. The Royal Canadian Navy had implemented equivalent measures. U.S. Navy records from January and February of 1942 document explicit awareness, at the district command level, of the silhouetting effect of coastal lighting on merchant vessels. And yet, the lights stayed on. The commercial and tourist interests of the Atlantic coast communities pressed their case through local political channels. The hotel associations of Miami and Virginia Beach argued that blackout ordinances would destroy the winter tourism season. This argument, in a country that had been at war for less than 6 weeks, was effective enough to delay the implementation of basic protective measures for months. U-boat commanders reported in their radio traffic back to BDU, traffic that the Allies were monitoring through the HF/DF network, though not yet reading in content, that conditions in American waters were, in one recorded formulation, excellent. The most damning element of the American coastal defense failure isn't the hotel lobby or the absent blackouts. It's the convoy question, and specifically, the Admiral Ernest King question. King was Chief of Naval Operations from late 1941, and he had access to comprehensive British Admiralty reports on the effectiveness of convoy escort systems going back 2 years. The British had built their convoy doctrine through painful, costly experience from 1939 to 1941. They'd lost thousands of ships learning what worked and what didn't, and they documented those lessons in reports that were available to Allied naval staff. King received those reports. He was briefed on their contents. He knew what the evidence said, and he did not implement mandatory coastal convoy escorts until May of 1942. A 4-month delay during which American coastal and Caribbean shipping losses ran to approximately 3.1 million tons. The post-war official history, written by Samuel Eliot Morison, characterizes King's delay as a regrettable but understandable resource problem. The subsequent historical literature, and particularly Michael Gannon's detailed archival work, makes a harder argument that King's personal institutional preferences and, by multiple accounts, his hostility toward British champion doctrine played a meaningful role in the delay. The primary documents, King's correspondence from January through March of 1942, support the harder argument. I've spent time with the King correspondence from this period, and what strikes me, and I want to be precise about this because it matters for how we understand the institutional failure, is that the objection wasn't purely about the availability of escort vessels, though that resource argument was real. The British had offered to loan escort vessels to American coastal defense in January of 1942. That offer was declined. The resource argument, in other words, had a remedy available that was refused. What persists in the correspondence, between the operational assessments and the resource discussions, is something that reads like a professional orientation, a preference for offensive operations over defensive convoy escort work, a sense that convoy defense was a reactive and therefore inferior posture, and a resistance, institutional rather than purely personal, to adopting operational doctrines whose intellectual origins lay in a British Navy that the American naval culture of that period regarded with complicated admixture of respect and competitive pride. King didn't invent that orientation. It was embedded in the culture he operated within, but he embodied it at a moment when it cost a very large number of lives. The human cost of the 6-month delay in implementing American coastal convoys exists not as an abstraction, but in the specific human geography of the communities along that coast. Small towns in North Carolina and Florida and Virginia, towns whose economies were tied to the sea, watched ships burn offshore and understood, in a way that the administrative records weren't acknowledging, that something had gone profoundly wrong with whatever plan there had been to protect the sea lanes past their shores. Oil slicks from unrecovered sunken tankers washed onto Florida beaches for months. Bodies washed ashore. Wreckage accumulated in water shallow enough to be visible from the shoreline. The U.S. Navy internally designated the Cape Hatteras to Key West stretch of coastline Torpedo Junction, a designation that entered public record only after the war, because the Office of Censorship had classified information about coastal losses throughout the first half of 1942. The tourists on the beaches were watching ships burn and being told, officially, that the situation was being managed. The Milch-Coup supply submarine, the Type 14 that Dönitz used to extend operational range in American waters, is a technical component of this period that significantly affected the scale of the losses and that doesn't get adequate attention. A Type 14 could transfer 203 tons of fuel and 15 torpedoes to operational boats at sea, effectively doubling patrol endurance. Without the Milch-Coup capability, the Type 9 boats operating off the American coast would have been limited to a single operational area within their independent range. With it, they could work the East Coast, refuel at a mid-Atlantic rendezvous, and extend into the Caribbean or Gulf of Mexico in the same deployment. The logistical multiplication effect was significant. Each supply submarine sortie extended the patrol range of approximately 12 frontline boats by 30 to 40 days each. The eventual Allied systematic destruction of all 10 Type 14 Milch-Coup, a campaign directed by intelligence we'll discuss in a later chapter, was one of the most strategically consequential and least publicly known operations of the entire Atlantic War. When mandatory coastal convoy escorts were finally implemented in May of 1942, the results were immediate and unambiguous. Shipping losses in American coastal waters dropped by approximately 80% within 6 weeks of full convoy implementation. 80%. The measure that had been available in January, that the British had been urging since December, that was demonstrably effective within weeks of adoption, had been delayed for 4 months while the losses accumulated. The operational utility of the convoy system wasn't a theory in May of 1942. It had been a demonstrated, documented, cross-Atlantic empirical reality for nearly 2 years. What the American coastal experience of the first half of 1942 reveals, with an uncomfortable clarity that the official histories have tended to soften, is that the single most effective defensive measure available was withheld from implementation, not by a lack of evidence, but by a combination of institutional preference, resource prioritization disputes, and the particular frictions that exist in coalition warfare between partners who respect each other less than their strategic alignment requires. The last tanker to burn off Cape Hatteras in the spring of 1942 went down sometime before the convoy routes were fully operational. The lighthouse at Cape Hatteras had been reporting oil slicks and debris for months by that point, filing reports through the Coast Guard chain of command, receiving acknowledgments, watching the coast darken with what had once been cargo holds. By the time the convoys came and the losses dropped, the ledger for those 6 months was already written. More than 400 ships, 3.1 million tons, thousands of merchant sailors dead in water so near the American shore that the fires were visible from the hotels on the beachfront. The hotels were full, the lights were on, and somewhere out there in the dark, the boats were doing their arithmetic too. Chapter 7. The Wolves of the Milk Sea. The 27th of October, 1941. Brest, occupied France. The harbor smells of diesel oil and salt water, and the particular mechanical sharpness of a working naval base. Grease, compressed air, the faint chemical bite of battery acid drifting from the submarine pens. U-96 is preparing to leave on its third war patrol. The loading has been going on since before dawn. Provisions stuffed into every available space. 14 torpedoes secured in their cradles and tubes, 250 cubic meters of diesel fuel drawn into the bunkers. The provisions loading alone has taken 18 hours. Food occupies the torpedo room floor. the passageways, the spaces under the bunks. For the first 2 weeks of the patrol, the crew will be eating their way through what is, temporarily, also their bedroom and their workshop. The boat is 67 men, and everything 67 men need to survive for 70 days, compressed into a steel cylinder 66.5 meters long. The gangway comes up at 0530 hours. The moorings are cast off. The boat moves out into the harbor approaches, turns northwest, and begins crossing the Bay of Biscay toward the open Atlantic. What I find remarkable about this specific patrol, and the reason I'm using it as the structural spine of this chapter, is the documentary record it left behind. Lothar Gunther Buchheim, a German war correspondent, sailed aboard U-96 during this deployment. He took photographs. He kept notes. He later wrote a novel based on his experience that became one of the most celebrated pieces of fiction to emerge from the Second World War. And then he spent the rest of his life in a complicated relationship with what the novel had and hadn't captured. The photographs exist in archive, the notes exist in archive, and the gap between what Buchheim chose to publish and what his contact sheets and unpublished notebooks actually record is, to me, the most honest entry point into the daily reality of the U-boat war. The novel showed the fear and the camaraderie and the violence. The contact sheets showed men sleeping 3 to a bunk, using torpedo cradles as pillows. The novel became famous. The contact sheets sat in boxes. The physical conditions aboard a Type 7 in the 3rd week of a North Atlantic patrol are worth reconstructing in some detail because they shaped everything. Tactical decisions, command relationships, the quality of the thinking that life or death situations demanded. By day 14, the provisions that had been stored in the torpedo room floor had been mostly consumed, which meant the floor was usable again, but also meant that the smell profile of the boat had shifted from cooking food to its steady-state composition. Diesel oil permeating every surface, the sour human scent of 50 men with inadequate washing facilities, the Swedish decay of food stored in corners and forgotten, battery acid in trace quantities from the cells aft, and underneath all of it, the cold damp of Atlantic Ocean pressing against the hull from outside. The light was artificial and constant. There was no day cycle aboard a submerged submarine, no natural signal for the body to regulate sleep against. Men slept in 4-hour intervals when they could, worked 8 hours, slept again, or tried to. The watch rotation was relentless. The noise was relentless. The temperature varied between too cold near the pressure hull and too warm near the diesel engines, and there was no middle. Buchheim's unpublished notes describe the commander of U-96, Heinrich Lehmann Willenbrock, known to his crew simply as the Old Man, though he was in his early 30s, at the periscope during an extended contact shadowing phase, approximately 13 days into the patrol. The boat had sighted a convoy and was maintaining contact at safe distance, transmitting position reports to BDU and waiting for the tactical picture to develop, waiting for other boats to be vectored toward the contact, for darkness to provide cover for a surface approach. The shadowing phase lasted approximately 14 hours. Buchheim notes that Lehmann Willenbrock did not sleep during this period. His notes describe the commander's face at the periscope at roughly hour 21 of continuous wakefulness, the eyes still open and functional, the facial muscles showing the distinctive slackness of extreme fatigue, the voice when he spoke still precise, still quiet, still authoritative. The technical performance continuing past the point where the physiological substrate supporting it had begun to fail. This is something the popular accounts don't usually engage with directly. The degree to which combat effectiveness in a U-boat at the command level required the sustained operation of a single human brain under conditions designed to degrade it. The attack when it came was, by Buchheim's account in his notes rather than in the published novel, workmanlike rather than dramatic. 4 torpedoes fired from the bow tubes in a calculated spread, 2 detonations. The crew's response to the hits wasn't triumph, or if it was a brief and private version that didn't translate into the collective behavior Buchheim was observing. Lehmann Willenbrock reportedly said only, "reload forward." And then the depth charges began. The escort had acquired the boat's position, probably by ASDIC return, possibly by visual sighting of the periscope, and the counterattack that followed was thorough and sustained. Buchheim's notes record 34 depth charge explosions in sequence. They record the sound as something that didn't enter through the ears in the conventional sense, but was felt through the hull, through the deck plates, through the soles of the feet and the base of the spine. They record cork insulation particles falling from the deckhead with each detonation, a fine dust of structural distress raining steadily down on the men standing at their stations. When I read the survivor testimonies from U-boat depth charge attacks collected during and after the war, I'm struck consistently by what the men describe as the hardest part. It wasn't the noise, though the noise was severe. One survivor described it as being inside a metal drum, while someone struck the outside with a hammer of indeterminate size, repeatedly, without rhythm. The hardest part was the interval between charges. The boat stopped. The motors went silent. 50 men stood at their stations or crouched at their posts, and did not move and did not speak. And in the silence they could hear things they couldn't hear when the machinery was running. Water running somewhere from a sprung fitting, the creak of hull metal under pressure, their own breathing. And they could hear the propeller sounds of the attacking vessels overhead, moving away, then turning, then moving back, coming again. The arithmetic that men did in those intervals, depth of water, estimated crush depth, number of charges already dropped, estimated remaining capacity of the attacking ship, was involuntary and continuous and couldn't be switched off, and it produced a particular kind of dread that wasn't panic, but was something quieter and more permanent. The air management problem during a sustained submerged period needs at least one technical paragraph here, because it's directly relevant to the quality of decisions made under exactly the kind of pressure that depth charge attacks created. The Type 7's CO2 scrubber cartridges, potassium superoxide compound, each lasted roughly 4 hours under normal consumption rates. Under the elevated respiration rates produced by fear and physical tension, consumption increased substantially. By hour 16 of a sustained submergence under attack, CO2 levels in a Type 7 routinely reached 2.5 to 3% by volume. At those concentrations, roughly 60 to 75 times the normal atmospheric level, cognitive function under stress was measurably impaired. Reaction times lengthened. Calculation errors increased. The spatial reasoning required to manage the boat's trim and depth became less reliable. The men who needed to make the best possible decisions about whether to attempt an emergency ascent, whether to make a quiet run for distance, whether the attacking vessel above them had lost the contact or was repositioning, those men were making those decisions in an atmosphere that was actively degrading their capacity to make them. The Kriegsmarine's operational documentation doesn't address this. The men managed as they managed. The photograph that Buchheim never published, the sequence of 12 frames from the aft torpedo room approximately 14 days into the patrol, showing 3 ratings sleeping in shifts on a single bunk, one with a bundled oilskin as a pillow, one using his own arm, one using a torpedo reload cradle, is the most honest visual document of the U-boat war that I'm aware of. The frames are technically poor, underexposed, slightly blurred, probably taken in the inadequate artificial light of the compartment without a flash. They don't show heroism or determination, or any of the qualities that the official photography program was designed to document and distribute. They show exhaustion. They show 3 young men in a metal tube in the middle of the Atlantic who are so tired that they have stopped caring what they're lying on. Buchheim looked at those contact sheets and decided not to publish them. I've thought about why. The novel needed men who were suffering nobly, who were afraid intelligently, who were human in ways that the reader could navigate and understand. Those photographs showed something less legible than noble suffering. They showed depletion. Lehman Willenbrock survived the war. He was one of the fortunate ones, and the statistics we'll look at more closely in a later chapter make clear just how fortunate. He served as a technical consultant to Wolfgang Petersen's film Das Boot in 1981, and was apparently a patient and thorough collaborator. A letter quoted by Buchheim in a later account records Lehman Willenbrock's private response after viewing the finished film. He told Buchheim that it was correct, but too romantic. When asked to elaborate in public, he declined. In the private letter, he added one sentence that has stayed with me. What it cannot show is that we were, most of the time, simply very cold and very tired. That sentence contains more operational truth about the U-boat war than most of the tactical accounts I've read. The cold and the tiredness weren't incidental to the campaign. They were its texture, the medium through which every tactical decision and every human response was filtered, patrol after patrol, year after year, until the boats stopped coming back. The U-96 returned to Brest at the end of that October patrol. The boat had done what it was sent to do: found convoys, reported contacts, attacked when opportunity allowed, survived the counterattacks. The crew disembarked, cleaned up, ate food that didn't come from a tin, slept in beds that didn't move, breathed air that wasn't recycled. They had 2 to 3 weeks before the next deployment. The boat went into refit, the diesel engines inspected, the torpedo tubes checked, the pressure hull examined for stress fractures from the depth charges, the air compressors serviced, the batteries tested and replaced where necessary. In the offices of BDU, Dönitz's staff updated the patrol records, noted the tonnage claimed, processed the after-action report, allocated the boat to its next operational assignment. The machinery of the campaign continued its rotation, and somewhere in the harbor, in the early November dark, the provisions for the next patrol were already being loaded. Chapter 8. The Code War. Enigma, Bletchley, and the Third Rotor. The 13th of February, 1942. Bletchley Park, Buckinghamshire. It is a Tuesday, and sometime during the previous 24 hours, the naval Enigma traffic that arrives at Hut 8 every morning has changed in a way that the codebreakers working the problem recognize immediately and with alarm. The messages are still coming in. The radio intercept stations are still catching U-boat transmissions. The teleprinters are still printing, but the mathematical structure of the traffic is different. A fourth rotor has been added to the naval Enigma machine. The 3-rotor problem that Hut 8's team had been solving, with increasing reliability and decreasing turnaround time for the past 18 months, has been replaced overnight by a 4-rotor problem whose solution space is 26 times larger. A memo goes to the director's office. It is terse in the way that bad news delivered by technically precise people tends to be terse. Naval Enigma is dark, it says. No current solution path identified. Estimate 2 to 6 months to resolution. The estimate is optimistic. It will take 10 months. And in those 10 months, more Allied ships will be sunk than in any equivalent period of the war. The history of signals intelligence in the Atlantic War is one of those subjects where the popular narrative, Enigma was broken, the Allies won, is true in outline and significantly misleading in detail. The breaking of the naval Enigma, designated Dolphin for the standard 3-rotor traffic, and Shark for the 4-rotor variant, was not a single event but a running competition between British cryptographic capability and German cipher management that produced the intelligence advantage intermittently, in windows of days or weeks, with periods of total darkness between them. The 10-month blackout that began in February of 1942 was the longest and most consequential of those dark periods, and it corresponds with a precision that is statistically overwhelming to the worst Allied shipping losses of the war. The convoys that were routed into Wolfpack patrol zones during that period were routed there, in many cases, because the routing authorities at Western Approaches Command didn't know where the Wolfpacks were. Before February of 1942, they had often known. After December of 1942, they would know again. In between, the ships went where the arithmetic of convoy scheduling directed them, without the intelligence correction that had been preserving lives for the previous 18 months. The 4-rotor naval Enigma machine, designated M4 by the Kriegsmarine, used a fixed reflector with a 4th rotor that could be set to 2 initial positions, effectively multiplying the M3's solution space by a factor of 26. The naval Shark traffic sat on a separate frequency network from the standard Dolphin traffic and the bomb machines. The electromechanical computing devices, designed by Alan Turing and engineered by Harold Keane at the British Tabulating Machine Company, that had been solving Dolphin with reasonable efficiency, were simply inadequate for the expanded solution space of Shark without significant modification. More machines were needed, or different machines, or both. The Americans, brought into the intelligence sharing arrangement after Pearl Harbor, began developing a high-speed bomb variant at the National Cash Register facility in Dayton, Ohio, the so-called Desh bomb, that could handle the 4-rotor problem. The Dayton machines wouldn't be fully operational until late 1942. The gap between February and late 1942 was covered, imperfectly, by the efforts of the Hut 8 team, working with inadequate equipment against a problem that had been deliberately designed to exceed their current capability. The capture of materials from U-559 in the eastern Mediterranean on the 30th of October 1942 is one of those moments in the intelligence war where the documentary record and the human story intersect in a way that I find both extraordinary and uncomfortable. The submarine was sinking, forced to the surface by depth charges from HMS Petard, HMS Hero, and HMS Pakenham, when Lieutenant Anthony Fasson and able seaman Colin Grazier went into the water and boarded the stricken vessel. They recovered an Enigma machine set to the 4-rotor configuration and 2 codebooks, and passed the materials to a 16-year-old canteen assistant named Tommy Brown, who had falsified his age to enlist and was the 3rd member of the boarding party. Brown made it back to HMS Petard with the materials. Fasson and Grazier drowned when U-559 sank beneath them. The materials they recovered reached Bletchley Park within days. Shark was broken in mid-December of 1942, roughly 6 weeks after the capture. Fasson and Grazier received posthumous George Crosses. Tommy Brown received a lesser commendation, continued his naval service for approximately 6 months, and was then discharged when the Navy discovered he had been 16, below the minimum service age, when he enlisted. He was given back pay and a railway warrant. The Navy's acknowledgement of what he had done in those minutes aboard U-559, as far as I can determine from the surviving records, ends there. The operational mechanism of the Enigma intelligence advantage is worth explaining carefully, because the popular narrative tends to collapse it into a simpler picture than the reality. Breaking Enigma didn't mean reading every German naval message in real time. It meant, on a good day, reading a batch of traffic from the previous 12 to 36 hours, sometimes more promptly, sometimes less, depending on how quickly the daily key settings could be determined and how many bomb runs were available. The critical application for convoy routing was the U-boat contact reports. When a submarine sighted a convoy and transmitted a position, course, and speed report back to BDU, that message, if decoded within a few hours, could be used by the submarine tracking room at Western Approach's command to reroute the convoy away from the inbound Wolfpack. This worked when it worked. It didn't work when the decode came too late, when the convoy couldn't be turned quickly enough given its speed and position, or when multiple Wolfpacks were deployed across an area wide enough that routing around one put a convoy into another. The intelligence advantage was real and significant. It was also partial, conditional, and operationally bounded in ways that the phrase, "they broke Enigma," doesn't begin to capture. There is a dimension of the intelligence war that the official histories handle with appropriate delicacy, and that I think deserves direct acknowledgement, because it represents one of the most morally weighted decisions of the entire campaign. Maintaining the secrecy of the Enigma penetration required that the Allies, when acting on ultra-intelligence, provide plausible alternative explanations for how they'd acquired the information. Convoy rerouting could be covered by attributing it to aerial reconnaissance or the reports of neutral vessels, but there were cases, documented in the post-war intelligence assessments, though the specific details remain partially classified, where the operational application of intelligence was deliberately constrained because full exploitation would have made the cryptographic penetration obvious to German cipher security. There were convoys whose routing was only partially modified when the intelligence warranted a larger correction. There were cases where the submarine tracking room had information that should, in a purely operational sense, have altered a tactical decision, but couldn't be fully used without risking the source. These decisions were made at the highest levels of naval command. They were made rationally, in the context of a strategic calculation that the long-term value of the intelligence source outweighed the short-term operational cost. And they resulted, in some number of cases that cannot be precisely determined, in ships being sunk that better exploitation of the available intelligence might have saved. The moral weight of those decisions belongs to the record. The German side of the cipher security story is, in its own way, as revealing as the British. The Kriegsmarine conducted at least 3 formal internal investigations during the war into whether naval Enigma had been compromised. All 3 concluded that it had not been. The investigations attributed Allied convoy routing accuracy to aerial reconnaissance, to agent networks, to the reports of neutral shipping, and, in a particularly interesting attribution, to statistical analysis of German radio traffic patterns that revealed Wolfpack deployments without requiring message content. Each of these alternative explanations had some validity as a partial account of Allied intelligence capabilities. None of them was the primary explanation. The Cipher security staff's inability to arrive at the correct conclusion wasn't simple incompetence. The Enigma machine was, by any reasonable pre-war cryptographic standard, extraordinarily secure, and the assumption that it hadn't been broken was mathematically defensible. What compounded the analytical failure was institutional. Questioning the security of Enigma meant questioning a system in which the Kriegsmarine had invested enormous confidence, and the internal culture of the Cipher security branch appears to have created conditions where motivated reasoning, the search for explanations that confirm the desired conclusion, operated with unusual freedom. The Hut-8 team at Bletchley worked 3 rotating shifts of 8 hours, 7 days a week, in conditions that the word Spartan undersells. The bomb machines ran continuously, electromechanical devices that tested candidate Enigma rotor configurations against known cribs, generating a noise that survivors described as a sustained mechanical clicking, thousands of electrical contacts cycling through candidate solutions in search of a configuration that produced recognizable German. The most reliable cribs for the naval Enigma traffic were the weather reports, standardized formats that included predictable phrases in specific positions, and the Kurzsignale brevity codes, which had stereotyped structures that the codebreakers could exploit. The majority of the bomb operators were women, Wren personnel, who ran the machines, interpreted their outputs, and maintained the operational tempo that the intelligence requirement demanded. Their contribution to the Atlantic War was, in the post-war official histories, and in the public narrative that developed around Bletchley Park, systematically secondary to the intellectual achievement of the cryptographers. The machines didn't run themselves. The analysis didn't conduct itself. The women who kept both operational worked the same shifts in the same cold huts, and are, in the detailed history of how this intelligence was produced, largely invisible. The 10 months between February and December of 1942 represent, in the shipping loss figures, the most concentrated human cost of the entire Atlantic campaign. Approximately 5.7 million gross tons of Allied shipping were lost in those 10 months. The 12 months preceding the blackout, when Dolphin was readable and convoy routing was benefiting from intelligence correction, had produced approximately 3.2 million tons of losses. The additional 2.5 million tons above the baseline trend, the attributable cost of 10 months of cryptographic darkness, represents thousands of ships, tens of thousands of sailors, and a strategic compression of Allied logistical capability at the moment when the American industrial mobilization was still ramping up and the outcome of the war was least certain. 2.5 million tons. That's approximately the entire pre-war merchant fleet of a medium-sized maritime nation, sent to the bottom of the Atlantic in the interval between one technical problem being solved and another being broken. The Dayton bomb ran its first successful 4-rotor Enigma decryption in late 1942, and from that point, the flow of naval Enigma intelligence, though never perfectly consistent, was sustained at a level that allowed systematic convoy routing corrections for the remainder of the war. The room in Hut-8 where the break was confirmed, the specific moment when the first Shark decrypt was verified against independent information, isn't recorded in any account I've been able to find with the vividness it deserves. It was probably unremarkable in the way that the resolutions of long technical problems often are. A result, checked against a crib, confirmed, passed to the submarine tracking room. The 10 months ended not with celebration, but with the resumption of work. The convoys were already at sea. The Wolfpacks were already deployed. What had changed, quietly, in a converted stable block in a country house in Buckinghamshire, was that the routing staff could now see them again. Chapter 9. The Milk Cows and the Long Reach. The 12th of June, 1943. Somewhere in the central Atlantic, at a position that existed in the Enigma traffic and in the Allied signals intelligence network simultaneously, though the men aboard the submarine didn't know the latter. U-459, a Type 14 supply submarine, a milchkuh, a milk cow, is surfaced in a moderate sea, conducting a fuel transfer with an operational boat that has come alongside for resupply. The transfer log that survives in the Bundesarchiv records the transaction with the precision of a ledger. 43.2 cubic meters of fuel oil transferred, 4 torpedoes winched across in the morning swell, provisions of Category B passed over in rubber dinghies, total transfer duration 6 hours and 20 minutes. Sea State 4, no aircraft contact. The notation at the end is routine, the handwriting even. 3 weeks later, the boat that received the fuel will be sunk. 4 weeks after that, U-459 itself will be sunk, caught surface by a British aircraft whose centimetric radar had found it in conditions the crew's instruments told them were safe. Both entries, the resupply record and the final departure log, are written in the same hand. The Type 14 Milchkuh is possibly the most under-examined vessel type of the entire Atlantic War, and the asymmetry between its strategic importance and its presence in the popular literature is striking. Without the supply submarines, the extended operations of the Second Happy Time would have been logistically impossible. The Type 9 long-range boats that struck the American coastal lanes and Caribbean routes in the first half of 1942 could reach those waters on their own fuel capacity, but their operational endurance, once on station, was finite. With a Milchkuh transfer at sea, that endurance doubled. A single Type 14 sortie could resupply approximately 12 operational boats, transferring to each a full complement of 203 tons of fuel, 15 torpedoes, and provisions for 30 additional patrol days. The multiplication effect on the fleet's operational capacity was not marginal. Each Milchkuh deployment effectively created the equivalent of 12 additional submarine patrols from existing assets, without requiring a single additional frontline hull to be commissioned. Dönitz understood this. The Allies understood it too, and the intelligence picture they were building throughout 1942 made the supply submarine network an extremely high-value target. The mechanics of an at-sea resupply between a Milchkuh and an operational boat require some description, because the vulnerability they created was structural and unavoidable. The process required both submarines to surface simultaneously at a prearranged coordinate, in open ocean, in whatever weather the Atlantic chose to provide. A proprietary armored flexible hose, the Betankungsschlauch, connected the supply submarine's deck manifold to the operational boat's fuel inlet valve via a wet coupling that had to be manually mated by sailors working on deck in sea states that rarely cooperated. The pressure rating of the hose was 8 bar. In seas above force 4, a common Atlantic condition, the coupling separated under wave action with enough regularity that manual reconnection was a standard operational expectation rather than an exceptional event. Men stood on wet, moving decks with fuel lines under pressure and did this work in the dark when security required it, in whatever temperatures the North Atlantic produced at that latitude and season. Accidents during transfer, hose ruptures, coupling failures, static discharge fuel spills, killed at least 4 men across documented incidents, not in combat but in logistics. The Allied decision to systematically destroy the Milchkuh network was made and executed with a precision that should have alarmed German cipher security much earlier than it did. Of the 10 Type 14 Milchkuh commissioned by the Kriegsmarine, all 10 were sunk. 9 of them concentrated in the 18-month period between early 1943 and mid-1944. The kill pattern was not the random distribution that would be expected from expanded Allied air coverage alone. Boats were being found at rendezvous coordinates, specific positions transmitted by Enigma, decoded at Bletchley, acted upon by aircraft directed to those coordinates. The frequency of kills at resupply positions was extraordinary. U-463 was sunk in July of 1943. U-460 was sunk in August. U-459, U-487, U-489, all gone within months of each other. The Kriegsmarine's internal security assessment flagged the pattern in a memorandum dated August of 1943. The response from the Cipher Security Branch, issued approximately 3 weeks later, attributed the losses to increased Allied air patrol coverage of the Central Atlantic, and dismissed the possibility of cryptographic compromise. The kills continued. When I look at the operational decision to destroy the Milchkuh through ultra-derived intelligence, knowing that the pattern of kills at encrypted rendezvous positions risked revealing the cryptographic penetration, I find it one of the most strategically complex decisions of the entire campaign. The choice was explicit: even if no single document records it as a formal policy statement. Accept the intelligence security risk in order to eliminate the supply network that was sustaining extended U-boat operations, or hold back and preserve the Enigma secret at the cost of allowing the Milch Coup to continue functioning. The decision went toward aggressive exploitation. The operational logic was sound. The Milch Coup network was multiplying the effective reach of the U-boat fleet in a way that was measurably extending the campaign's destructive capacity, and eliminating it would produce a concrete, calculable operational benefit. The intelligence security risk was real but manageable, given the German cipher staff's demonstrated resilience to the correct conclusion. The decision was probably the right one. I find I still sit with it uncomfortably, because it required accepting that a pattern of kills would be visible to anyone willing to look for it, and trusting that the Germans wouldn't look hard enough. The human cost of the Milch Coup campaign is a number that deserves to be said clearly. Of the crews of all 10 Type 14 supply submarines, approximately 691 men died. The survival rate across all 10 boats was roughly 7%. These were not frontline combat sailors in the conventional understanding of that term. They carried no torpedoes. Their deck armament was minimal. When found on the surface by an aircraft or a surface escort, their options were to dive and hope, or to fight with weapons entirely inadequate for the threat, or to be killed in the water when the boat went down too fast for everyone to get out. Most did not get out. The men who operated the fuel transfer hoses, who winched torpedoes across in the swell, who baked fresh bread in the Milch Coup's galley to pass over to frontline crews who hadn't tasted it in weeks, 691 of them didn't come home. Their deaths were operational decisions at a level of command they never knew existed. Their names appear on the memorial at Moltenort, alongside the frontline crews, in the same typography, without distinction. There is a particular footnote to the Milch Coup story that I want to include, because it illustrates the way that the intelligence war created connections that nobody planned. In the spring of 1944, U-488 conducted what would be one of the final Milch Coup resupply operations of the war, successfully transferring fuel and torpedoes to several frontline boats before being sunk in April of that year. Among the boats she resupplied during her final patrol was U-505. In June of 1944, U-505 was captured intact by the U.S. Navy's Task Group 22.3, boarded, secured, and towed to port with her Enigma equipment, her rotor settings, and her codebooks intact. The intelligence materials taken from U-505 confirmed and extended what the Bletchley operation had been providing for years. The supply submarine that the Allies had killed using ultra-intelligence had indirectly resupplied the boat whose capture would further validate what Ultra had been telling them. These are not the kinds of connections that appear on tactical maps. The operational productivity statistics of the Type 14 program make a painful kind of arithmetic. Each Milch Coup sortie extended the patrol range of approximately 12 frontline submarines by 30 to 40 days each, generating somewhere between 360 and 480 additional submarine patrol days of operational capability per deployment. The Allied destruction of all 10 Milch Coup removed, in aggregate, somewhere between 3,600 and 4,800 submarine patrol days of potential U-boat operational capacity from the war's total. Translated into tonnage foregone, at the wartime average of roughly 4,000 tons of Allied shipping sunk per boat per patrol, the elimination of the supply submarine network may have prevented the sinking of somewhere between 14 and 19 million tons of additional Allied merchant shipping, though any such figure is necessarily speculative. What is not speculative is that each of those averted patrols represents not only saved Allied shipping, but also the probable survival of a U-boat crew that would otherwise have been deployed into an ocean that was, by late 1943, becoming extraordinarily lethal for operational submarines. The last Type 14, U-490, was sunk in June of 1944, caught in the Central Atlantic and destroyed by aircraft from USS Croatan, an escort carrier. She went down with the majority of her crew. By that point, the Milch Coup network, as an operational system, had effectively ceased to function. The remaining frontline U-boats were fitted with snorkels and were spending most of their operational time submerged, which made at-sea fuel transfer essentially impossible without surfacing in conditions that had become prohibitively dangerous. The logistical architecture that had extended the U-boat campaign's reach into American coastal waters and sustained the Caribbean operations of 1942 had been dismantled, methodically, using intelligence derived from the Enigma traffic that directed those same operations. The supply submarines transmitted their rendezvous coordinates in the same cipher that their killers were reading. The network's own communications were the mechanism of its destruction. Dönitz's cipher staff looked at the loss pattern 3 times and found alternative explanations each time. The boats kept going to their coordinates. The aircraft kept finding them there. The transfer log from U-459, entry 47, dated June of 1943, fuel 43.2 cubic meters, torpedoes 4, provisions category B, 6 hours and 20 minutes, sea state 4, no aircraft contact, is the kind of document that a military archive preserves without ceremony. It was routine work, dutifully recorded. The sailor who wrote those entries in that even hand couldn't have known that the coordinates of the rendezvous that produced those entries had been read in England and acted upon, and that the aircraft that would find the boat 3 weeks later was already being assigned to a patrol box calculated from that information. He wrote what happened. He noted no aircraft contact. He filed his log. The boat continued its patrol, and in the archives at Freiburg, the log continues in the same hand for 3 more weeks, right up to the last entry, before the date when U-459 went to the bottom of the Bay of Biscay with most of her crew aboard, and the handwriting in the archive simply stops. Chapter 10. Letters Home, The Human Cost in Ink. The 3rd of October, 1941, Hamburg. A letter is being read in a kitchen by a woman named. The archive protects her identity, in the way that letters from the front were read in kitchens and sitting rooms all over Germany, carefully, in good light, more than once. The letter is from her son, a machinist's mate somewhere at sea. It runs to 3 pages and covers, in the way that letters from young men to their mothers tend to cover, the things that were safe to say. His preference for her potato salad over the cook's version, his interest in model railways, his belief that the war would be over soon. The censor has read it before her. The censor found nothing to flag. On the lower right corner of the 3rd page, in a different pressure of pen, written later clearly, as something added after the main body of the letter was finished, there are 4 words in notably smaller handwriting. Bete für uns, Mutter. Pray for us, Mother. The archivist at Marineschule Merwick, where this letter is held, catalogued it in the standard way. Sender classification, date, boat identifier withheld. 4 words in small handwriting, in the margin of an otherwise routine letter, that contain everything the 3 preceding pages were careful not to say. The personal correspondence of U-boat crewmen is a primary source category that has been, in the historiography of the Atlantic War, consistently secondary to the operational records. The tactical analyses, the fleet deployment figures, the convoy loss statistics, those are the documents that the major histories are built on, and the reasons for this are understandable. The letters don't tell you why the tonnage war turned when it turned, or what the Enigma blackout cost in statistical terms, or how the centimetric radar changed the kill probability calculations. What they tell you is something the operational records are structurally incapable of telling you. What the people inside the boats understood about what was happening to them, and how that understanding changed as the war changed around them. I've spent time with the collection at Marineschule Merwick, 23 letters from crew members across different ranks and different years of the war. And what the collection shows, read in sequence, is the progressive moral and psychological arc of the campaign, in a register that no after-action report ever captured. The letters from 1940 and early 1941 have a quality that I describe, after reading enough of them, as genuine. Not propagandistic, not performed, genuinely confident, genuinely committed to the idea that the war was going well and would continue to go well and would end in reasonable time, with Germany in a reasonable position. The ideological alignment is present, but it's not strident. It reads more like the background assumptions of a culture than the deliberate assertions of a convinced political actor. These men had grown up in a Germany that had been politically and ideologically reshaped throughout their formative years, and the worldview that appears in the letters reflects that upbringing without apparent self-consciousness. What's interesting, and this is something I find myself returning to when I think about the cultural history of this campaign, is how quickly and how cleanly the ideology falls away as the war goes on. By 1942, it's barely present. By 1943, it's essentially gone. What replaces it is something more elemental and more honest, the language of duty without conviction, and underneath that, very quietly, the language of survival. The shift is gradual, and it's documented in small verbal signals rather than explicit statements. A letter from late 1941 includes the phrase, "I do not ask whether it will succeed. I ask only whether I will be there when it does." The distinction between personal survival and mission success has opened into a gap you can see clearly if you read it next to the letters from a year earlier. By the middle of 1942, that gap has widened. A rating whose letter I've read, his name and boat identifier withheld per the archive's protocols, writes in August of that year about the boat's previous commander having been killed, and the one before that. He notes, with a flatness that is its own kind of eloquence, that he has now had 3 commanders, and that the average seems to be about 8 months. He doesn't complete the calculation in the letter. The white space at the end of the sentence does it for him. He has done the arithmetic of his own situation, and he has reached a conclusion that the censor apparently found acceptable, or perhaps found human enough to let through. The censorship system that governed outgoing mail from U-boat bases is itself a document of what the institutional culture was willing to acknowledge and what it wasn't. Every letter was read by a censor before dispatch. Content was prohibited in several categories: operational details, port names, patrol areas, and a category the regulations designated as expressions of defeatism or anti-state sentiment, anything that communicated doubt about the outcome of the war or criticism of the leadership. Letters containing flagged content were confiscated. The writer faced formal proceedings. The practical effect of this on the archive is double-edged. On one hand, the expressions of doubt and fear that survived in the letters were either sufficiently oblique that censors didn't flag them, or the censors, themselves frequently naval personnel, sometimes U-boat service veterans, exercised a private human judgment about what constituted dangerous expression and what constituted natural human anxiety. The 4 words in the margin of the Hamburg letter, "Pray for us, Mother," are arguably on the line. The censor let them through. I think that's significant, though I'm careful not to overinterpret a single data point. When I was working through the morale assessment reports filed by flotilla commanders in 1942, reports that went upward through the command chain to Dönitz's own quarterly assessments for OKM, and comparing them against the letter collections from the same period, the disconnection between the 2 source types is striking enough that it demands an explanation. The official morale reports from 1942 characterize crew morale as good or adequate throughout the year. Dönitz's own quarterly assessments report no significant morale problems in the submarine service until well into 1943. The letters from the same period tell a different story, not of collapse or refusal, nothing so dramatic, but of a steady and progressive erosion of the kind of confident, forward-looking commitment that characterized the early war correspondence. The gap between what the official assessments reported and what the private letters actually contained is too consistent and too wide to be explained by sampling error. It reflects an institutional mechanism for the management of information upward, whether deliberate or structural, that the commanders operating within it either didn't question or couldn't. The religious dimension of the U-boat letters is something that the popular accounts almost never address, and I find it genuinely interesting as a cultural data point. A significant proportion of U-boat crewmen were practicing Catholics, a fact visible in the letters in references to specific prayers, to rosary beads carried aboard, to the intercession of particular saints before departure on patrol. This sits in considerable tension with the official ideology of the regime they were serving, which maintained a complicated and often actively hostile relationship with the institutional Catholic Church throughout the war years. Men carrying rosary beads in their pockets and writing home to ask their mothers to light candles for them were operating within a spiritual framework that had no sanctioned place in the culture of the National Socialist military. The censors apparently found this unremarkable. Perhaps it was too universal to flag. Perhaps the pragmatic calculation was that men who believed something was watching over them fought harder than men who believed nothing was. Whatever the institutional reasoning, the letters are full of it, and it complicates the picture of who these men actually were, as distinct from who the official narrative required them to be. The letters from the spring of 1943, the months approaching Black May, though the men writing them didn't know that's what it would be called, or that it was coming, or exactly what it would mean, have a quality that I find difficult to describe precisely without resorting to the kind of emotional shorthand that these men didn't use. They're not despairing. They're not resigned in any simple sense. They're contracted. The world that appears in them has shrunk to the size of what can be held in memory and named without risk. A specific tree in a garden at home, a specific dog, a specific meal. The letters have stopped talking about when the war will end, or what will happen after, or what Germany will look like in 5 years. They talk about now, and specifically about the small things that constitute the texture of a life being lived close to its possible end. A torpedo mechanic writes in March of that year, in a letter that his family received after his death in May, that whatever happens, he was here. He existed. The boat is real. You are real. That is enough. The censor passed it. His family kept it. It is in the archive now, catalogued with a reference number, preserved without ceremony in a gray folder among 22 others. The statistical reality of what those letters were written inside is something that Dönitz's command knew with numerical precision. By the end of 1942, a newly commissioned crew entering frontline service had a statistical life expectancy of approximately 4.6 patrols before their boat was lost, roughly 14 months of operational service. This figure was available to BDU in its planning documents. It was derived from the loss rates that the command was tracking with the same meticulous attention it brought to the tonnage figures. The men writing home in the spring of 1943 were, in the statistical sense, approaching the end of their expected operational life, and the command that sent them out knew this in the same register that it knew how many tons of shipping had been sunk that month. I find it impossible to read both sources simultaneously, the letters and the planning documents, without feeling the distance between them as something more than an archival juxtaposition. The archive at Marine Schule Merwick is a quiet place. The letters are held in gray folders in acid-free storage. Each one has been read by its recipient, then kept rather than destroyed, which is itself a kind of decision, a small act of preservation against the erasure that comes with time and grief. The handwriting varies. Some of it is careful and schooled, some of it rushed and compressed, some of it written clearly in good light at a desk, some of it written in the cramped quarters of a submarine where the paper sat on your knee and the pen caught the vibration of the diesels in the line. They're ordinary letters mostly. They talk about food and weather and family and the small coordinates of a life conducted at distance from everything familiar. And occasionally, in the margins or in the final lines, they say the thing that the main body of the letter was navigating around, in 4 words or 6, in a pressure of pen slightly different from the rest of the page. The archive preserves those too, without distinction, in the same gray folders, with the same reference numbers, in the same quiet room. Chapter 11. The Escort Hunters. Walker, McIntyre, and the Killers. The 14th of December, 1941, Liverpool. A Royal Navy officer named Frederick John Walker, aged 45, is sitting somewhere in the Western Approaches Command administrative structure, reviewing orders for his new posting. He has been passed over for promotion 8 times, 8 separate occasions on which the Admiralty's selection process evaluated his professional record and found him not quite suitable for advancement. He is being given command of HMS Stork, a sloop, not a destroyer, a second-tier escort vessel, in what amounts, by the conventions of the Royal Navy's peacetime career architecture, to a terminal posting, a competent officer in an uncompetitive billet, doing his duty, moving toward retirement. Within 6 months, Walker will have sunk 6 U-boats. Within 2 years, his name will be in the House of Commons. Within 3 years, he will be dead from a cerebral hemorrhage at 48, having refused to take leave for so long that the Navy's own medical officer had warned him his physical condition was critical. The institution that passed him over 8 times will bury him with full honors. These are the particular ironies of a military bureaucracy encountering a man it was not built to recognize. The anti-submarine warfare doctrine of the Royal Navy in 1941 was, when you look at it carefully, against what it was being asked to do, a document that reflected peacetime assumptions about a wartime problem. The standard depth charge attack procedure required the attacking ship to pass directly over the submarine's ASDIC contact position and drop charges as it crossed. The problem with this procedure was structural and had been known since ASDIC was introduced. The sonar transducer's geometry created a dead zone directly beneath the attacking ship. As the attacker ran in over the contact, it lost the sonar return. The submarine commander knew, from the cessation of the ASDIC ping, that an attack was imminent, and had approximately 5 seconds of warning before the charges arrived. 5 seconds was enough to change course, change depth, change speed. The charges exploded in the vicinity of where the submarine had been. The submarine was no longer there. The attacker circled back, reacquired the contact at a distance, and ran in again. The submarine moved again. The procedure was generating expensive expenditure of depth charges against an opponent who had learned to anticipate it, and it was producing kill rates that, when Walker analyzed them against the number of confirmed contacts and the number of charges expended, struck him as unacceptably low. Walker's response to this problem was not to request a review committee or to submit a formal proposal through the Admiralty's channels. He wrote his own tactical procedure, typed it up, and distributed it to his escort group outside official channels. The document, held in the Walker collection at the Maritime Museum in Liverpool, with a marginal annotation in his handwriting on the Admiralty's standard manual that I find wonderfully direct in its dismissal of received doctrine, describes what became known as the creeping attack. The procedure used 2 ships rather than 1. The first ship maintained continuous ASDIC contact at safe distance, vectoring the second, the creeper, toward the submarine by voice radio, providing constant course and depth corrections. The creeper approached from the submarine's beam at low speed, silent, not transmitting its own ASDIC. The submarine couldn't hear it coming. The creeper dropped a precisely calculated pattern of charges, designed to bracket the contact's entire estimated position volume, not to target a single point, as the standard attack did, but to fill a volume of water with lethal overpressure, from which deviation was unlikely to provide safety. The submarine had no warning, no 5-second evasion window. The geometry of the defense had been removed. The Mark 7 depth charge that Walker's groups used from 1942 onwards carried a Torpex explosive filling that was approximately 40% more powerful per unit weight than the earlier Amitol compound, due to Torpex's superior shock-wave propagation characteristics in water. The standard charge weighed 196 kilograms and produced a lethal overpressure radius of approximately 7 to 8 meters against a submerged hull, sufficient to crack pressure hull weld seams, rupture flood valve gaskets, and destroy battery banks at that range. A near miss within 15 meters could cause sufficient structural damage to force a submarine to surface. A hit within 7 meters was, in most cases, fatal. Walker's creeping attack delivered charges in patterns of 26, dropped in a calculated sequence at precise time intervals, designed to produce an overpressure envelope that encompassed the target's estimated position volume before any evasive maneuvering could move the boat clear of the pattern. The mathematics of this were worked out on paper, in pencil, by Walker and his officers during the inter-patrol periods in Liverpool, using the data from previous engagements to refine the drop intervals and pattern geometry. It was operational research being conducted without an operational research section, by a group of naval officers who understood that the problem was mathematical before it was tactical. The support group concept, Walker's other major contribution to the tactical architecture of the Atlantic War, met institutional resistance that, given what the concept eventually achieved, is difficult to look at without frustration. Walker's argument was straightforward. The standard practice of assigning escort groups permanently to specific convoys meant that when a U-boat contact was made, the escorts could pursue only as far as the convoy's safe radius before they had to turn back. The U-boat simply ran, waited, and returned. An independent support group, a fast escort group with no convoy assignment, free to pursue contacts to a conclusion, could hunt until the hunt was finished. The Admiralty's counter-argument, internally coherent but operationally conservative, was that detaching escort assets from convoy protection would leave convoys more vulnerable. Walker's response, developed from the operational data of his own patrols, was that a single effective support group could kill more U-boats than 5 conventional escort groups combined, and that the long-term reduction in U-boat operational strength produced by kills was more valuable than the marginal increase in convoy vulnerability during the hunt. He was correct, and the support group concept was eventually adopted. It was adopted over his objections that it wasn't being adopted fast enough, and against a timeline that cost ships and men while the argument was being processed. I've spent time in the Walker collection, and what strikes me when I read his tactical documents, alongside his personnel file, is a particular kind of professional isolation that I find characteristic of men who are right before their institutions are ready to recognize it. The tactical papers are precise, technically demanding, Clear argued. The personnel file shows the 8 promotion passes. These two things sit side by side in the archive, and don't resolve into an easy explanation. The promotion selection system wasn't populated by stupid people. The Admiralty in peacetime had legitimate criteria for advancement that Walker, by temperament and by professional focus, didn't satisfy in the conventional way. He was not a comfortable institutional presence. He was obsessive about anti-submarine warfare, in an era when anti-submarine warfare was not a prestigious specialization. He developed tactical procedures outside official channels and distributed them informally, which is not the behavior of a man who has internalized the promotion norms of a hierarchical institution. The institution that passed him over 8 times was doing what institutions do, selecting for the qualities that peacetime management requires. The war required different qualities entirely, and the Navy nearly let him retire before it found this out. Walker's second support group operated in the Bay of Biscay and the North Atlantic from 1943, with an effectiveness that the operational statistics record in terms that require no rhetorical elaboration. In his final operational year, 1943 to 1944, the group sank 14 U-boats in 8 months. 1 U-boat every 17 days, on average, across a sustained operational tempo that Walker maintained by the simple method of refusing to leave the sea. He was ashore only when the ships needed maintenance or resupply that he couldn't avoid. The shore time was spent reviewing the patrol data, refining the attack procedures, briefing the crews. His wife Eileen, in letters from this period, describes a husband she saw in disconnected fragments between deployments, who slept badly even in a shore bed, who talked in his sleep in the specific urgent register of a man directing an attack run. He had been doing this since 1941. The cumulative physiological cost was, by early 1944, visible to anyone who spent time with him. The sourcing dispute over Walker's kill count is a minor historiographical wrinkle, but it's worth acknowledging because it illustrates something about how military credit is assigned. HMS Starling is officially credited with 14 confirmed U-boat kills, the highest figure for any single Allied warship in the Atlantic War. The operational records of the second support group show several kills where credit attribution between participating vessels was ambiguous, and where the Admiralty's post-war official accounting made specific allocations that the surviving officers of other group vessels have disputed in memoir accounts. Donald McIntyre, an escort commander of considerable distinction himself, raised questions about the Starling count in his own post-war writing. The Admiralty's attributions stand as the official record. I raise this not to diminish what Walker achieved. The aggregate performance of the second support group is extraordinary, regardless of how the individual kills are distributed, but because the credit allocation process reflects how institutions manage historical ownership of achievement, and the management isn't always clean. Walker died on the 9th of July, 1944, in a naval hospital in Liverpool, of a cerebral hemorrhage. Churchill announced the death in the House of Commons. The King sent a personal message. The Navy mounted a full honors funeral. The tactical manuals that Walker had developed, the creeping attack procedure, the support group doctrine, the patrol data analysis framework, were eventually formalized by the Admiralty and published as standard doctrine. The formal publication, issued in August of 1944, lists no individual author. Walker's name doesn't appear in the document. The procedure is presented as standard Admiralty anti-submarine attack doctrine, origin unspecified. The institution absorbed what the individual had developed and issued it as anonymous standard practice, which is precisely how institutions preserve and propagate innovation, by detaching it from its human source and making it institutional property. This is operationally sensible. It means the knowledge survives the individual. But in Walker's case, given the 8 promotion passes and the informal distribution, and the years of institutional resistance, the anonymization of the doctrine in the formal publication reads like one last act of institutional normalization by a Navy that had, throughout his career, preferred its innovators to work within the system rather than around it. The second support group continued operating after Walker's death, under new command, using the procedures he had developed. The war continued. The Bay of Biscay continued to be hunted. The U-boats continued to die in it. In the Walker collection, among the tactical papers and the patrol reports and the correspondence with Western Approaches Command, there is a letter from Eileen Walker to the Admiralty, dated approximately 3 weeks after her husband's death. It asks, in careful formal language, whether the Admiralty intends to publish her husband's tactical notes in a form that would acknowledge his contribution to their development. The Admiralty's reply, if one was sent, does not appear in the collection. There's just the letter and the absence of a response, and the tactical manual published 6 weeks later with no author's name attached. The file sits in Liverpool, in a maritime museum, in a city where the Battle of the Atlantic was fought from the shore as much as from the sea. Walker's name is on the wall outside. Inside, in the collection, the question his wife asked is still, technically, unanswered. Chapter 12. Blackout on the St. Lawrence. The War Nobody Saw. The 14th of October, 1942, the Cabot Strait, between Cape Breton Island and the southwest coast of Newfoundland. 0351 hours, ship's time. The passenger ferry SS Caribou is running her regular route between North Sydney, Nova Scotia, and Port aux Basques, Newfoundland, a route she has run hundreds of times, carrying passengers and mail and freight across a stretch of water that in peacetime is a domestic crossing, a journey between communities. She carries 237 people, 118 civilians including 57 women and children, and 119 military personnel in various categories. She is not a warship. She has no armor, no meaningful defensive armament, no capability to detect or engage a submerged submarine. She is a ferry in a strait that a German submarine designated U-69 under Friedrich Wilhelm Edis has been patrolling since approximately midnight. At 0351, the torpedo hits. The Caribou sinks in under 5 minutes. 136 of her 237 passengers and crew die, including 31 of the 57 women and 16 of the children. The Canadian government issues a press release 2 days later. 47 words, no casualty list, no vessel details beyond the name. It will be 6 months before the full toll appears in any Canadian publication. The U-boat campaign in the St. Lawrence River and Gulf is possibly the most successfully suppressed domestic wartime event in the history of any Allied nation, and the suppression itself is as interesting historically as the campaign it concealed. Between the summer and autumn of 1942, at least 4 German submarines, U-553, U-132, U-517, and U-165, operated in the St. Lawrence system, penetrating more than 1,000 kilometers into the North American interior. The furthest documented penetration reached within 300 kilometers of Quebec City. Ships were sinking in water that Canadians could see from the south shore of the St. Lawrence River. Oil slicks were washing onto beaches. Bodies were washing ashore. The government of Prime Minister Mackenzie King issued instructions through its censorship machinery, formal, explicit, covering all media in all categories, that no reference to U-boat activity, shipping losses, or naval engagements in the St. Lawrence was to appear in any publication or broadcast. A directive in the Canadian National Archives, dated September of 1942, extends this restriction explicitly to passenger vessel losses. The Caribou sailed and sank 3 weeks after that directive was issued. The political arithmetic behind the censorship is documented with unusual candor in the internal cabinet records, which were partially declassified in the 1970s. The government's concern was not primarily military security. The information being suppressed was already known to the communities on the riverbanks, to the fishing vessels that pulled bodies from the water, to the harbor pilots and lighthouse keepers who were filing reports through the Coast Guard chain that acknowledged the situation clearly. The concern was political and economic. Full public acknowledgement of U-boat activity in the St. Lawrence would generate irresistible pressure to close the river to ocean-going shipping. Closing the river would disrupt the trade flow through the St. Lawrence seaway ports, Montreal, Quebec City, the industrial centers of the interior, with consequences for the war economy that the government calculated as serious. There was also, and the cabinet records are candid about this, the specific political sensitivity of Quebec, where the conscription debate was already inflaming the relationship between French and English Canada. A U-boat campaign in the St. Lawrence, publicly acknowledged, was precisely the kind of news that the most politically volatile region of the country least needed to receive. The ASDIC problem in the St. Lawrence is a technical detail that the military accounts of the campaign acknowledge, but the broader histories tend to omit, and it matters for understanding why the submarines were as effective as they were in waters that close to a defended coastline. The Canadian escort vessels operating in the St. Lawrence in 1942 were equipped with Type 123 ASDIC sets, the same equipment type that the Royal Navy had been deploying in the open Atlantic. That equipment had been calibrated for North Atlantic deep water conditions, where the water column was relatively uniform in temperature and the ASDIC beam propagated in a reasonably predictable arc. The St. Lawrence is not the open Atlantic. The river and Gulf system has pronounced thermocline layers, sharp temperature gradients at varying depths across the seasons, that cause sonar beams to refract unpredictably, producing false contacts at short range and missing genuine contacts at distances as short as 400 meters. The vendor documentation for the Type 123 explicitly noted that the equipment had not been tested or calibrated for shallow or thermocline stratified environments. The Canadian Navy was using deep water equipment in shallow, stratified water, without recalibration, against submarines that were, by the autumn of 1942, becoming increasingly sophisticated in exploiting exactly this kind of acoustic environment. The human geography of the South Shore communities facing the St. Lawrence during the autumn of 1942 is a part of this story that doesn't appear in any operational record and survives only in local histories, parish registers, and the memories of the communities themselves. Fishing villages and small towns along the south bank of the river watched burning ships at night. They pulled wreckage off their beaches in the morning. They heard the explosions carried across the water. They filed reports through local officials that went up through provincial and federal chains and became, in the official record, acknowledged private information that could not be publicly confirmed. The government's censorship directive was effective as a media management tool. It was not effective as a means of preventing the communities closest to the campaign from understanding what was happening. What it did was create a disconnect between what those communities knew from direct observation and what they were permitted to say, read, or hear through official channels. The effect on local trust in government communications in the communities most directly affected was not studied at the time and has been inadequately examined since. There's a specific element of this story that I find particularly revealing as a case study in information management under pressure. When accurate information about U-boat activity in the St. Lawrence was suppressed, the resulting informational vacuum was filled by rumor, and the rumors that filled it were, in some documented cases, considerably more alarming than the reality. Communities along the south shore of the St. Lawrence, observing burning ships and unable to get official explanations, developed a body of popular belief attributing some of the explosions to German saboteurs operating on shore. This was false. There were no German saboteurs on the south bank of the St. Lawrence, but the rumor was consistent with the observations, couldn't be publicly refuted without acknowledging what was actually happening, and, in Quebec specifically, fed into existing anxieties about the loyalty of various community groups in ways that had their own political toxicity. The suppression of accurate information didn't create a neutral informational environment. It created a distorted one, and the distortions had their own consequences. The closure of the St. Lawrence to ocean-going vessels came in November of 1942, under pressure from accumulating losses that couldn't be entirely concealed. The announcement, made publicly by the government, implicitly acknowledged everything that the censorship directive had been suppressing for months. The political cost of the closure was significant. The military cost, in diverted shipping through Halifax and alternative Atlantic routes, was calculated in internal Admiralty records as adding approximately 12% to convoy transit times for affected North American coastal routes. This additional 12%, multiplied across all affected voyages for the remainder of 1942 and into 1943, represented a meaningful logistical burden on an Allied shipping system that was already running under severe pressure. The 23 ships, totaling approximately 85,000 tons, that had been sunk in the St. Lawrence system were the direct loss. The knock-on effects of the defensive response to those losses continued accumulating long after the U-boats had left the river. The historians who have worked most seriously with the St. Lawrence campaign, Mark Milner, James Lamb, and in more recent years, a number of Canadian naval scholars whose archival access has improved as documents have been progressively declassified, are in agreement that the suppression of information about U-boat activity in the river had operational as well as political consequences. Local civil defense improvements that would have required public acknowledgement of the threat were delayed. Coordination between naval authorities and civilian coastal communities, potentially valuable given the community's direct observational capacity, was inhibited by the classified status of the underlying situation. The Caribou sailed without the kind of intelligence coordination that, had the full operational picture been acknowledged, might have produced different routing decisions for a passenger vessel in a known threat area. Whether different routing would have saved her is unknowable. That the censorship contributed to the conditions in which her sailing was not questioned is more demonstrable. The St. Lawrence campaign ended not through a decisive military engagement, but through a seasonal and tactical combination. The autumn weather deteriorating the conditions for submarine operations, the closure of the river to ocean-going traffic removing the primary targets, and the U-boats' own attrition rates across the Atlantic, forcing resource reallocation to other operational zones. The submarines left the river. The oil slicks dissipated from the beaches. The government's censorship directive remained in force. The communities on the South Shore continued to know what they knew. In the National Archives in Ottawa, the censorship directive sits in its file, a half-sheet, stamped "Most Secret," with the handwritten edition extending the restriction to passenger vessel losses, dated 3 weeks before the Caribou sailed. The directive achieved its immediate purpose. The Caribou went to the bottom of the Cabot Strait regardless, with 136 of her passengers and crew, 3 weeks after someone in the chain of command decided that protecting the information was worth extending to cover a passenger ferry in a known threat area. The file is very thin. The directive is very clear. The handwriting on the edition is very even. Chapter 13, Black May, The Tide Breaks. The 28th of April, 1943. The North Atlantic, roughly 600 nautical miles southwest of Iceland. Convoy ONS-5. 42 merchant vessels in a loose formation, headed west-southwest, running in weather that the escort commander's logs describe as severe, is being found. The finding isn't dramatic in the way that tactical accounts tend to make it. There is no single moment of discovery, no sudden illumination. There is, instead, the slow accumulation of a tactical situation, a U-boat on the convoy's periphery, transmitting a contact report in the early hours of the morning, and somewhere in the frequency spectrum of the North Atlantic, a British shore station's high-frequency direction finding equipment logging the transmission's bearing. Then another bearing, from a second station, a triangulated position, a notation in the submarine tracking room at Western Approach's command, and somewhere in the mid-Atlantic darkness, 31 German submarines beginning to converge on a convoy that doesn't yet know they're coming. The battle that follows will last 8 days, cost 13 merchant ships and 6 U-boats, and demonstrate, in the specific arithmetic of its kill ratio, that something fundamental has changed in who this ocean is more dangerous for. The difficulty with writing about Black May of 1943 is that its significance is visible only in retrospect and in aggregate, and neither of those perspectives was available to the men who lived through it. The commanders of the escort groups defending ONS-5 and the subsequent convoys of that month were not aware, in the moment, that they were participating in a strategic inflection. They were running attacks, managing fuel states, responding to radar contacts in fog so thick that ships in the same convoy couldn't see each other. The awareness that something decisive was happening came later, from the monthly loss tables and the production figures, and Dönitz's own withdrawal signal at the end of May. What I want to do in this chapter is work through how it actually happened, not as a single dramatic reversal, but as the convergence of at least 7 separate technological and tactical developments that had been building independently for months and arrived simultaneously, within a window of approximately 6 weeks, with a combined effect that no single one of them could have produced alone. The first of the 7 convergences is the centimetric radar, and it deserves careful technical attention because it is the most important single piece of equipment in the story of how Black May happened. The Allied transition from metric wavelength radar, which the German METOX receiver could detect, to 10-centimeter wavelength radar, operating at 3 GHz, was completed for frontline operational use in early 1943. The 10-centimeter system, designated ASV Mark III on aircraft and fitted to surface escorts as well, produced a radar signal at a frequency approximately 17 times higher than the METOX's detection band. The METOX, in the presence of the new radar, was not degraded. It was simply blind to it, as completely as a domestic radio receiver is blind to a television broadcast. U-boat commanders surfacing at night to charge their batteries, relying on the METOX to warn them of approaching aircraft, were surfacing into a radar environment their instrument could not detect. They believed they were safe because their warning system was silent. Their warning system was silent because it was incapable of hearing what was looking for them. The second convergence is the very long-range B-24 Liberator aircraft, specifically the variant modified for coastal command use, with additional fuel tanks, depth charges, and the 10-centimeter radar. The Mid-Atlantic Gap, the area roughly between 30 degrees west and 45 degrees west longitude, beyond the practical range of land-based aircraft from both Britain and Newfoundland, had been a reliable sanctuary for U-boats throughout the first 3 years of the war. Convoys crossing this zone did so without air cover. U-boats operating in it could surface freely to recharge batteries and transmit contact reports without risk from aircraft. The modified Liberator closed this gap in the spring of 1943. Not fully, not immediately, but enough. A B-24 operating from Iceland or Northern Ireland could now reach the Central Atlantic Gap Zone, spend several hours on patrol, and return. The sanctuary was not eliminated. It was compromised. And compromised was enough, because the U-boat doctrine had been built on the assumption that it was inviolable. The third convergence is the escort carrier, a small carrier, modified from a merchant hull, capable of operating perhaps a dozen aircraft and accompanying a convoy at convoy speed. HMS Biter joined convoy operations in the spring of 1943. She wasn't a fleet carrier. She wasn't fast. Her aircraft complement was modest, and her weather operating limits were narrow. But she provided something that no convoy had ever had before: organic air cover in the mid-ocean zone, available on demand rather than on the schedule of distant land bases. The fourth convergence is the expansion of the HF/DF network to a coverage density that allowed real-time triangulation of U-boat contact reports at ranges that permitted meaningful convoy rerouting. The fifth is the formal establishment of independent support groups on Walker's model, free to pursue contacts to conclusion. The sixth is the Hedgehog, a forward-throwing anti-submarine weapon that projected a pattern of 24 contact-fused projectiles ahead of the attacking ship, allowing attack without the attacking ship passing over the contact and losing ASDIC return in the dead zone. The seventh, and this is one that rarely appears at the front of the list, is the full deployment of Torpex-filled depth charges in sufficient quantities to equip all frontline escort vessels, replacing the less effective Amitol compound charges that had been standard earlier in the war. The Battle of Convoy ONS-5 ran from the 28th of April to the 6th of May, in conditions that the escort commander's logs describe with a consistency that accumulates into something close to misery. Fog varying from 50 to 200 yards visibility, sea states between 3 and 5, temperatures near freezing, equipment operating at or near its tolerance limits. The convoy's close escort included British and Canadian corvettes and destroyers operating as a coherent group under Commander Peter Gretton in HMS Duncan. The tactical picture on the night of the 4th of May, when the battle reached its most intense phase, involved U-boats attacking from multiple quadrants simultaneously, fog so dense that the corvette HMS Pink could not see her companion vessels, and escorts that were using 10-centimeter radar to detect and engage contacts that were invisible to the naked eye at any range. The after-action report of HMS Pink, submitted on the 10th of May, describes a U-boat engagement in terms of almost administrative brevity. Contact at 800 yards on radar. The vessel accelerated to ramming speed. U-boat had not commenced diving at point of contact. The boat being rammed is U-192. The bow of HMS Pink is dented. Her captain reports her seaworthy. The report is 4 pages. It is written in the flat, declarative tone of a man who understands that what he's describing is a job completed rather than a heroic act. The METOX problem, specifically the months-long failure of the German submarine command to correctly diagnose why their boats were being found at night, is one of those intelligence and institutional failures that becomes clearer in retrospect than it could possibly have been in the moment. And I want to be precise about what it tells us. When U-boats began being attacked at night in circumstances where their METOX receivers showed no warning, the first hypothesis that emerged within the German command was that Allied aircraft were homing on the radio frequency emissions generated by the METOX receiver itself. This hypothesis was incorrect, but it was not irrational. The METOX did emit low-level radio frequency interference, and direction finding against receiver emissions was a documented technique in the signals intelligence literature. The German response, ordering reduced METOX use, investigating the emission profile, conducting trials, was professionally competent given the wrong hypothesis. The correct hypothesis, that the new centimetric radar was operating at a frequency entirely outside the METOX's detection band, apparently wasn't formally established and communicated to operational commanders until well after the May crisis. For the months between the centimetric radar's operational deployment and the correct diagnosis of how it was working, U-boat commanders operated with a warning instrument they trusted and shouldn't have. In an electronic environment they believed they understood and didn't. When I was cross-referencing the individual U-boat loss records for May of 1943 against the operational records of the Allied units credited with the kills, I found a distribution that is itself analytically interesting. Of the 41 U-boats lost that month, aircraft account for a substantial majority, roughly 25 to 28, depending on how shared kills are allocated, with surface escort vessels accounting for most of the remainder. The aircraft kills break down between Coastal Command land-based aircraft in the Bay of Biscay transit zone, carrier-based aircraft operating with convoy groups, and VLR liberators in the mid-Atlantic. What this distribution tells you is that the decisive technological shift of Black May was primarily an air power story rather than a surface escort story. Or, more precisely, it was the story of what happened when air power and surface escort were combined with sufficient coverage to eliminate the safe spaces that U-boat doctrine had depended on. Not one of those capabilities was individually decisive. The liberators without the centimetric radar were less effective. The centimetric radar without the liberators left the mid-Atlantic gap open. The support groups without air cover couldn't hold down a diving U-boat long enough to achieve a kill. Together, in May of 1943, they produced a month that killed 41 submarines. The operational statistics of Black May deserve to be presented in the specific form that makes their significance unambiguous. In May of 1943, U-boats sank 264,852 tons of Allied shipping, losing 41 submarines in the process. The kill rate, the tonnage sunk per U-boat lost, was approximately 6,460 tons per boat. In May of 1942, exactly 1 year earlier, U-boats had sunk approximately 600,000 tons while losing 4 boats, a kill rate of roughly 150,000 tons per boat. The operational efficiency of the U-boat campaign had declined by a factor of approximately 23 in 12 months. Put differently, in May of 1943, it was costing the Kriegsmarine a submarine to sink roughly 6,000 tons of Allied shipping. In May of 1942, one submarine's loss corresponded to 150,000 tons sunk. The mathematics of that deterioration don't require rhetorical amplification. They are their own argument. Dönitz's withdrawal signal, transmitted on the 24th of May, 1943, directed U-boats to vacate the North Atlantic convoy routes. His war diary entry for that date states with an uncharacteristic directness that the enemy has found means to render the boats ineffective, and that the command cannot contend with it. He does not identify in the diary entry what those means are. His analysts had not yet correctly diagnosed the full combination of technologies and tactics that had produced the May results. What Dönitz had was the end-of-month loss tables and the patrol reports and the arithmetic of what had just happened. And the arithmetic was unambiguous. He withdrew the boats. He did not stop the campaign. He would continue sending submarines into the Atlantic for the remaining 2 years of the war, and more than 600 U-boat crewmen would die after the withdrawal signal was sent. But the strategic contest for the Atlantic supply lines, the question of whether Germany could sink Allied shipping faster than it was being built, the fundamental premise of the entire tonnage war, ended on the 24th of May, 1943. The boats continued. The war they were fighting had already been lost. The fog lifted over the North Atlantic on the 7th of May, 1943, the morning after the most intense phase of the ONS-5 battle. The convoy was intact, battered, reduced, but intact, its remaining vessels continuing their westward course. In the water around the battle area, oil slicks and wreckage marked where 6 U-boats had gone down in 8 days of fighting. The escort vessels were low on fuel and ammunition. HMS Duncan had been detached for refueling at a critical moment and missed part of the battle. HMS Pink's bow was dented from the ramming. The corvettes that had done the night fighting in the fog were running on the accumulated mechanical and human stress of a week at general quarters in North Atlantic winter conditions. There was nothing triumphant about how the week ended. The merchant ships that had been lost went down with their crews and their cargo. The U-boats that had been killed went down with their crews too. What remained, when the fog cleared and the arithmetic was counted, was a battle that had demonstrated, in the specific ratio of losses on each side, that the ocean had changed. The question that had been running since September of 1939, who does the Atlantic belong to, had its answer. Chapter 14, the snorkel, the acoustic torpedo, and the desperate technological scramble. The 15th of September, 1943, the North Atlantic, roughly 400 miles west of Ireland. It is the first week of the new German offensive, boats returning to the convoy routes after the summer withdrawal, equipped with new weapons that BDU believes have changed the tactical equation. The weapon is designated the T5 Zaunkönig, an acoustic homing torpedo, the first operationally deployed homing weapon in the Atlantic War, designed to detect the propeller cavitation noise of Allied escort vessels and guide itself to the source. It has been in development since 1942. It is now operational. In the first week of its deployment, it sinks 9 Allied escort vessels. For a brief, alarming period in the autumn of 1943, the ships that had been destroying U-boats are themselves being destroyed by weapons that seek them specifically. Not the merchant vessels, not the cargo, but the escorts themselves. The Admiralty's response is urgent and direct. The counter-weapon it develops will take 72 hours to produce and deploy. These are the compressed timescales of a technological war that has moved beyond the pace at which any peacetime development cycle could have operated. The engineering of the T5 Zaunkönig is worth understanding in detail because the specific technical parameters of the weapon determine both its effectiveness and its countermeasures with a precision that is almost elegant in retrospect. The torpedo used 2 hydrophones separated by 200 millimeters in its nose section, connected to a differential amplifier that compared signal strength between the sensors and activated steering vanes to home on the louder source. The system was effective against targets moving between 10 and 18 knots, the typical speed range of an Allied corvette or destroyer escort in convoy operations. Below 7 knots, the propeller cavitation signature moved outside the hydrophone's effective sensitivity band. Above 20 knots, the same thing happened. This speed dependency was not a marginal limitation. It defined, with mathematical precision, the exact tactical response that Allied escort commanders needed to adopt when a Zaunkönig attack was suspected. Accelerate above 20 knots, and the homing head lost guidance. The information about this limitation was in the weapons test reports at the Torpedo Experimental Institute in Eckernförde. Those reports were classified. The Allies didn't have them. What the Allies had, after the first week of Zaunkönig operations, was the empirical observation that the weapon was killing escorts, and the engineering task of understanding how to stop it. The Foxer countermeasure, developed at HMS Vernon, the torpedo and mining establishment at Portsmouth, was an exercise in applied simplicity that the elegance of the problem it was solving doesn't immediately suggest. The Foxer consisted of two sets of interlocked steel pipes, mounted on frames and trailed on cables astern of an escort vessel, designed to create an acoustic signature louder than the ship's own propellers. The physics were straightforward. The Zonkönig's homing head sought the loudest propeller frequency acoustic source in its detection range. A Foxer trailing 50 meters astern of a ship produced more noise at the relevant frequencies than the ship's own screws. The homing head followed the noise. The torpedo detonated against the Foxer, or, in some cases, ran past it and lost guidance. The ship survived. The development timeline from the first analysis of the Zonkönig's acoustic homing principle to the first Foxers being fitted to operational escort vessels was approximately 72 hours. The intellectual infrastructure that produced this, the technical staff at HMS Vernon, the Admiralty's torpedo development section, the operational research community that had been working the anti-submarine problem since 1941, had been built up over years of sustained investment in exactly the kind of problem-solving capacity that allowed a new threat to be met within 3 days of its identification. There is a detail in the T5 Zonkönig's test documentation that I find characteristic of the particular institutional failure modes that appear throughout this story. The test reports from the Torpedo Experimental Institute include a clearly stated safety limitation. The torpedo's homing system could not discriminate between its target and the submarine that had fired it if the separation distance fell below 400 meters at the moment of launch. The weapon would, in these circumstances, home on its own launch vessel. The warning, explicit, documented, included in the test reports, was apparently not communicated with sufficient urgency to all operational commanders before the weapon's deployment. The evidence for this is indirect but persuasive. At least 2, possibly 3, German submarines were lost to their own acoustic torpedoes during the weapon's operational lifespan, in engagements where the separation distance at time of firing was insufficient. The after-analysis of these losses, conducted within the Kriegsmarine's own technical branches, was classified. The operational commanders who might have benefited from the information were not told the full picture, apparently out of concern that disseminating information about the weapon's self-homing failure mode would reduce the willingness of crews to use it. The institutional decision to manage the information in this way contributed to the deaths of men who were operating a weapon whose failure mode they hadn't been adequately warned about. The Schnorkel in German designation, addressed the centimetric radar problem in the most direct way available, by allowing the submarine to remain permanently submerged while running on diesel engines for battery charging. The mast, when raised to periscope depth, admitted air to the diesels and exhausted the combustion gases above the waterline. The technical solution was not new. Dutch submarines had used a primitive version before the German occupation of the Netherlands in 1940, and German naval engineers had been aware of the concept for some time. The delay in its widespread adoption is one of those bureaucratic and institutional stories that appears periodically in weapons development history, a capability that exists in principle, that the operational requirement for is clearly demonstrated, that nonetheless takes longer to reach operational deployment than the urgency of the situation seems to justify. The Schnorkel became standard fitting on frontline U-boats from early 1944. It kept boats permanently submerged. It addressed the radar detection problem, and it introduced its own constellation of operational difficulties that the optimistic assessments of the technology had not fully anticipated. The Schnorkel's operational problems were real and persistent. The head valve, a float-operated mechanism that closed the air intake when a wave submerged the mast, failed periodically. When it failed, diesel exhaust gases were drawn back into the submarine's interior instead of being expelled. The effects on crew performance of a sudden burst of diesel exhaust in an already CO2-rich atmosphere were immediate and sometimes incapacitating. Within seconds, men at their stations experienced headaches, disorientation, and in documented severe cases, loss of consciousness. The mast itself, extending above the surface, was detectable by centimetric radar, not as reliably as a surfaced submarine, but with enough consistency that Allied aircraft and escorts fitted with sufficiently sensitive equipment could find it. Snorkel-equipped submarines were also limited in speed. Running on diesel at periscope depth, the maximum sustainable speed was approximately 5 to 7 knots, which meant a snorkel boat could not shadow a fast convoy or make effective use of position to intercept a routed convoy. The weapon that addressed the radar problem simultaneously degraded the tactical mobility that the Wolfpack doctrine required. The Germans were solving one problem and creating another, and the rate at which they were creating new problems was exceeding their capacity to solve the previous ones. The Type 21 electro-boot is the what-if of this period that Dönitz's post-war memoir made the most of, and it deserves a measured assessment rather than either the dismissal it sometimes receives or the strategic significance his memoirs claim for it. The design was genuinely innovative, 3 battery banks providing 3 times the stored electrical energy of the standard Type 7C, a sustained submerged speed of 17.2 knots, faster than most surface escorts, and a passive hydrophone array, the Gruppenhorchgerät, capable of detecting convoy ASDIC transmissions at ranges of up to 50 nautical miles. This last capability was perhaps the most significant. A Type 21 could find a convoy passively, without transmitting any radio or radar signal, approach it submerged at high speed, and attack and withdraw without ever surfacing. The centimetric radar problem, the HF/DF problem, the Lee light problem, none of them applied to a boat that never needed to surface. The strategic argument that the Type 21 was a potential war winner has genuine technical substance. What undermines it is the production history. The first Type 21 boats were commissioned in mid-1944. Their working up trials revealed significant construction quality problems that required extensive rectification, and only 2 conducted frontline patrols before Germany's surrender. Neither sank a ship. The Type 21 that might have changed the war existed in the blueprints and in the political argument about who was responsible for the delayed construction priority. It never existed operationally at any scale that could have affected the outcome. The Alberic anechoic coating, thin rubber tiles bonded to the pressure hull of late-war U-boats to absorb ASDIC sonar energy and reduce detection range, is a technological footnote that's worth including because it illustrates the general condition of German naval technology development in the war's final years. The principle worked. Testing showed ASDIC detection range reductions of 15 to 20% against coated hulls. The engineering failed. The adhesive used to bond the tiles to the curved pressure hull couldn't withstand the repeated pressure cycling of multiple deep dives. The tiles separated, producing irregular hull roughness that was, in terms of sonar detectability, worse than an uncoated surface due to increased cavitation noise and turbulent flow characteristics. The Kriegsmarine had developed and tested a technology that worked in controlled conditions and failed in operational use, and deployed it to frontline boats before the bonding failure was adequately resolved. This pattern, development outrunning quality control, testing conditions failing to anticipate operational realities, production pressure overriding engineering rigor, appears throughout the history of German naval weapons development in the Atlantic War. It is the same pattern that produced the torpedo depth-keeping fault of 1939. The institutional mechanisms that had allowed that fault to persist into operational use had apparently not been resolved in the intervening 5 years. The German Navy's technological response to Black May was genuine in its ambition and limited in its execution, and I think the honest assessment is that the limitation was structural rather than technical. The weapons scientists and engineers at the torpedo institutes and the submarine design bureaus were capable people working real problems with real ingenuity. The Zaunkönig was a genuine operational innovation. The Type 21 was a genuine engineering advance. The Schnorkel was a real solution to a real problem. What the German technical program could not produce, by the autumn of 1943, was the industrial scale and organizational agility required to convert technical concepts into deployed operational capability faster than the Allies could produce countermeasures. The Allies' advantage was not that they had better engineers. It was that they had a larger industrial base, more effective inter-service and inter-allied coordination of technical intelligence, and an institutional infrastructure for rapid countermeasure development, exemplified by the HMS Vernon Foxer response that had been deliberately built and was operating at the speed the war required. Germany was developing weapons. The Allies were developing weapons and counterweapons simultaneously. and doing it faster. The last operational patrol of a Zonkonig-equipped U-boat in the major convoy battles of the Atlantic ended somewhere in the early months of 1944, as the combination of Fokker deployment, evasion doctrine, and the general deterioration of U-boat operational effectiveness reduced the weapon from a tactical shock to a manageable threat. The Fokker was imperfect. It created its own noise problems, affected ship speed and maneuverability, and required maintenance that added to escort vessel operational burdens. But it worked well enough to remove the Zonkonig as a decisive tactical factor within weeks of its first operational use. The weapon that had taken 2 years to develop and killed 9 escort vessels in its first week was managed into irrelevance within a month. In the Torpedo Experimental Institute at Eckernförde, the engineers working the next generation of homing torpedo problems would have understood the lesson, if anyone had permitted the lesson to be stated clearly. The Allied countermeasure cycle was faster than the German development cycle. The race was not winnable at the pace being run. Chapter 15. The Boys of the Kriegsmarine, Child Soldiers and the Manpower Crisis. The 14th of September, 1943, Pillau, East Prussia. A training school evaluation report is being completed by an instructor whose name the Bundesarchiv record preserves, but whose rank and personal details I'm going to leave unmarked, because what matters here isn't who he was, but what he wrote. The report covers Crew Class 43B, 47 officers and ratings who have completed their U-boat training program and are being posted to the 7th Flotilla at Brest. The instructor's summary section lists 3 skill categories: torpedo mechanics, adequate; diving procedures, adequate; emergency valve operation, the manual isolation procedures for a flooding compartment, the skill most likely to determine whether a damaged submarine survives or not, inadequate. His recommendation: 6 additional weeks of flooding simulator training. Time available for additional training: 0 weeks. Below the inadequacy notation, in a different register, the flotilla assignment order rather than the instructor's assessment. The departure date: the 4th of October, 1943. Of the 47 men in Class 43B, 39 will be dead within 8 months. The manpower story of the U-boat war is one that exists in plain sight in the personnel and training records, and that the popular histories consistently underweight because it doesn't have the dramatic texture of a convoy battle or a code-breaking breakthrough. It's an administrative story. It's a story about forms and training schedules, and the gap between what the forms said and what the men inside the boats were actually capable of. But what the forms record, read carefully over the full arc of the war, is a progressive and deliberate institutional decision to send inadequately prepared men into an operational environment where inadequate preparation was fatal. Not occasionally, not in exceptional circumstances, but as a systematic practice driven by the arithmetic of a casualty rate that was consuming trained personnel faster than the training pipeline could replace them. By late 1943, that pipeline was producing replacements at roughly 30% of the rate required to maintain current operational strength. The fleet was not holding steady. It was consuming itself. The training compression timeline is documented with enough specificity in the U-boat Schule records to be precise about what was cut and when. Standard U-boat training in 1940 ran to approximately 6 months. Basic technical qualification, extended sea time in the Baltic, tactical exercises in simulated attack and defensive scenarios. By the middle of 1942, operational demands and casualty replacement requirements had compressed this to approximately 4 months. By the autumn of 1943, the period that Crew Class 43B represents, some classes were completing programs in as little as 10 weeks. 6 months reduced to 10 weeks is not a reduction. It is the elimination of everything that the 6-month program contained beyond the minimum technical orientation required to operate the equipment. The skills that took the longest to acquire under genuine stress conditions, the flooding valve sequences, the crash dive procedures, the damage control responses that had to work correctly in the dark, in cold water, under acoustic shock, were precisely the skills that the compressed timeline cut first, because they required the most facility time and the most repetition to internalize reliably. The age demographics of the U-boat crews across the war's span are one of those data series that you look at and then look at again, because the number is not what you expect, even when you already know the story. U-boat crew records, cross-referenced from the German naval personnel files, show an average crew age of approximately 25.1 years in September of 1939. By December of 1943, the average was approximately 20.3 years. By early 1945, U-boats were being commissioned with crews whose average age was under 20, and several documented cases in the personnel records show ratings listed as 16 years, 11 months, below the nominal minimum service age, technically compliant with the wartime emergency legislation that had reduced that minimum to 16, but representing a reality where boys who had been in secondary education 2 years earlier were operating flood control equipment in submarines at 200 meters depth under depth charge attack. The institutional response to this reality in the official documentation is the absence of any institutional response. The records note the age. They process the posting. They don't comment. The commander's own pre-departure assessments from this period are, when they survive, among the most uncomfortable documents in the German Naval Archive. Several frontline commanders filed formal reports before their final patrols, noting specific crew skill deficiencies, ratings with insufficient practical experience of emergency procedures, junior officers who had not completed the full attack training sequence, engine room personnel whose familiarity with the specific configuration of their boat's systems was limited to classroom instruction rather than operational handling. These reports went up through the flotilla command chain. In at least several documented cases, they were noted, filed, and the boat was dispatched on schedule, regardless. The operational requirement for boats at sea outweighed the commander's assessments of crew readiness. The weight given to those assessments in the command decision-making process is visible in the outcome. The boats sailed. The inadequately prepared crew members were at their stations when the patrols began. And in the specific cases where we can trace what happened, where the patrol record ends and the boat is marked as lost, the connection between documented inadequacy and the manner of loss is sometimes visible and always possible. I've been working with the letter collections from this period alongside the training records, and what I find when I read them together is a correspondence between the emotional register of the letters and the objective data in the training files that the letters themselves don't explicitly acknowledge, but that the juxtaposition makes impossible to ignore. The men in the letters from 1943 and 1944 are young, younger than the men in the early war letters, not just statistically, but in the voice, in the concerns, in the specific texture of what they write home about. They write about things that young men who haven't been away from home before write about: missing specific foods, asking about specific family members, describing their physical environment with the slightly overwhelmed attention of someone for whom everything is still new. They are not the professional naval officers of the first wave crews, men who had been at sea before the war, and for whom the ocean was a familiar, if dangerous, workplace. They are teenagers in submarines, and the gap between what the training records say they can do and what the operational environment will require of them is not, in any honest accounting, acceptable. The Iron Cross distribution data from this period has a quality that I find genuinely difficult to categorize. Personnel records show that the decoration rate for U-boat service accelerated sharply in 1943 and 1944, precisely the period of catastrophic loss rates and declining crew quality. The Iron Cross First Class, Germany's second highest combat decoration, was awarded to U-boat personnel at rates substantially higher than any other branch of the Wehrmacht throughout the war. But the acceleration in the worst period of the campaign is particularly marked. In at least several documented cases, decorations were dispatched to families simultaneously with death notifications, the same postal delivery carrying both the announcement of a son's death and the state's formal recognition of his service. The families received both pieces of paper on the same day. What they were supposed to do with the juxtaposition is not something the administrative machinery that generated both documents appears to have considered. The decoration was processed on its schedule. The death notification was processed on its schedule. The simultaneity was a logistical outcome, rather than an intentional act, which in some ways makes it worse. The BDU quarterly manpower and training status reports, the documents that reached Dönitz's headquarters level and that his staff reviewed and signed, contain the training duration statistics that make the command's awareness of the compression program unambiguous. The argument that Dönitz was not informed of the degradation in training standards because intermediate command levels managed the scheduling is, in the light of these quarterly reports, an argument that the surviving documentation does not support. The reports are formal. They are signed at appropriate levels. They contain the training duration figures. They contain the crew qualification assessment summaries. The decisions that were made in the face of what those reports described, to continue committing new crews, to maintain or increase operational tempo, to dispatch boats with documented crew deficiencies, were made with the information available. Whether this constitutes a moral failure, a strategic miscalculation, or simply the operation of an institutional logic that had become disconnected from any realistic assessment of achievable outcomes, is a question I don't think the archive answers definitively. What it answers is the factual question of who knew what when. And the answer to that question is, the command knew. The mortality statistics of the U-boat arm across the full war are well established, but they need to be situated against the specific concentration of losses in the final 2 years. Of the approximately 28,000 to 30,000 U-boat personnel who died in the war, roughly 62% of those deaths occurred in the period from the second half of 1943 through the German surrender in May of 1945. This is the period of maximum training compression and minimum crew age. It is also the period when Dönitz's command had the clearest documentary awareness that the operational environment had turned decisively against his boats. The withdrawal signal of May 1943, the analysis of what had produced Black May, the progressive loss rate data in the quarterly summaries. The decision to continue the campaign through this period, committing increasingly young and undertrained crews to an operational environment whose lethality was documented and known, produced the majority of the human cost of the entire Atlantic War in the war's final 2 years. The 40,000 men who served in U-boats suffered a 70 to 75% mortality rate overall. For those who entered service after the autumn of 1943, the rate was higher. The evaluation report from Pillau, Crew Class 43B, emergency valve operation inadequate, 6 additional weeks recommended, 0 weeks available, departure the 4th of October, sits in its file at the Bundesarchiv in the way that bureaucratic documents sit, without emphasis, without apology, as one record among thousands in a series covering wartime naval personnel administration. The instructor who wrote it did his job. He assessed the crew honestly. He documented the deficiency. He filed the recommendation. The system processed the filing and sent the boat on schedule. The 39 men who were dead within 8 months included, almost certainly, men whose emergency valve operation was inadequate. Whether inadequate valve operation contributed to any specific loss is impossible to determine from the surviving records. What is documented is that it was known to be inadequate before they sailed, that the knowledge was recorded, that it changed nothing. The report was filed. The departure date was met. The patrol began on schedule. And in the Bundesarchiv, the recommendation for 6 additional weeks of training sits next to the posting order for the 4th of October, in the same gray folder, in the same file, as if the distance between the two documents were not the distance between a life and its end. Chapter 16. The Bay of Biscay, Slaughterhouse of the Transit Routes. The 3rd of November, 1942. Northwood, Middlesex, RAF, Coastal Command Headquarters. A physicist named Patrick Blackett is sitting at a desk with a calculation sheet in front of him. That is, in terms of its eventual consequences, one of the most important pieces of applied mathematics produced during the Second World War. Blackett is not at a university. He is a scientific advisor in a military headquarters, and what he is doing with his calculation sheet is treating the problem of finding and killing German submarines as if it were a problem in probability theory, which it is, and which nobody before him in this building had formally recognized it to be. The calculation on his sheet determines, from first principles, the probability that a randomly patrolling aircraft will encounter a transiting U-boat in the Bay of Biscay as a function of 3 variables: the total area being patrolled, the number of aircraft hours being flown, and the detection range of the aircraft's equipment. When the calculation is complete, the figure at the bottom of the sheet is 4.7%. That is, the probability, given the current patrol allocation and equipment, that any given U-boat transiting the bay on any given day will be sighted by an Allied aircraft. In the margin, Blackett writes a sentence that is as much a research program as it is an annotation. This is why we are not winning. The question is, what allocation makes 4.7% into something useful? Every U-boat operating from the French Atlantic bases, Brest, Lorient, Saint-Nazaire, La Pallice, Bordeaux, had to cross the Bay of Biscay twice on every combat patrol, once outbound to the Atlantic operational areas, once inbound returning to base. The bay crossing covered approximately 300 nautical miles of open sea. It was within range of Allied land-based aircraft from both British bases and, as the war progressed, from Portuguese bases in the Azores. It was not, at the beginning of the war, within range of effective air attack. The aircraft available were limited in endurance, their radar was inadequate for reliable night or bad weather detection, and their weapons were only marginally effective against a diving submarine. But the bay was a fixed geography. Every boat had to cross it. Every boat was, during the crossing, in a defined area where its position could be predicted within a statistical distribution. Blackett's insight, and it was an insight, even if it sounds obvious in retrospect, was that this predictable geography made the bay not a random search problem, but an optimization problem. You weren't looking for submarines in the ocean. You were looking for submarines in a defined transit corridor, at predictable speeds, in predictable sea conditions. The mathematics of systematic search, properly applied, could tell you exactly where to put the aircraft to maximize the probability of contact. The Lee Light, a 22 million candle-power airborne searchlight, fitted to RAF Wellington aircraft from June of 1942, was the weapon that made Blackett's night patrol calculations operationally executable. Before the Lee Light, a U-boat surfacing after dark to charge its batteries was, for practical purposes, invisible to aircraft. The boat had to surface every night. The battery technology of the period made this non-negotiable. The charge depleted by submerged running had to be restored at the surface. This nightly surfacing was the structural vulnerability that the Lee Light exploited. An aircraft could detect a surfaced submarine by radar, make a silent approach in the dark, and illuminate the target at close range with the searchlight at the moment of attack. The U-boat crew on the conning tower, their eyes adjusted to darkness, would be suddenly and completely blinded. The aircraft would be past the point of effective evasive action before the crew could respond. Attacks conducted with this combination, centimetric radar for detection, Lee Light for terminal illumination, depth charges dropped in a bracket pattern, produced kill rates that transformed the bay from a manageable inconvenience for transiting U-boats into something considerably more lethal. The operational research section that Blackett headed produced, over the period from late 1942 through 1944, a series of patrol allocation recommendations that reconfigured the distribution of Coastal Command aircraft across the bay in ways that sound technical and modest, and had consequences that were neither. The section tracked, month by month, the relationship between aircraft patrol hours flown, contacts made per patrol hour, and kills achieved per contact. In August of 1942, the kill rate per U-boat sighting was approximately 0.14, one confirmed kill for every 7 sightings. By July of 1943, following the full implementation of the section's patrol optimization recommendations, combined with the centimetric radar and Lee Light deployments, the kill rate had risen to approximately 0.41, roughly 1 kill per 2.4 sightings. The improvement was not primarily technological. The radar and the Lee Light had been available for some months before the kill rate improvement reached its peak. What changed between the introduction of the equipment and the achievement of maximum kill rates was the application of systematic search theory to the question of where to place aircraft to maximize the probability of contact in the first instance. Equipment worked better when the search it was conducting had been mathematically optimized. Blackett proved this in numbers, month by month, in the operational research files that now sit in the National Archives under the AIR series. The mathematical framework that Blackett's section applied to the Bay Patrol problem has a history that is worth noting, because the history is itself part of the story of how this war was won, intellectually as well as militarily. The core equation relating detection probability to search effort, detection range, and target density is one that Blackett and his colleagues derived, in large part, from empirical Bay Patrol data, working backward from the observed relationship between patrol hours and sighting rates to the theoretical model that explained and predicted it. The equation they derived was not simply a description of what had been observed. It was a predictive tool. Given a proposed change in patrol allocation, the model predicted the change in expected sighting rate. Given an observed change in U-boat transiting behavior, the model prescribed the reallocation required to maintain detection probability. The section was doing, in real time, what we would now call adaptive optimization, adjusting the search pattern in response to new information about the target's behavior, guided by a mathematical model rather than tactical intuition. The model wasn't perfect. The data it ran on was incomplete and sometimes delayed, but it was better than anything else available, and it improved continuously as more data was collected and analyzed. There is a dimension of Blackett's work at Coastal Command that the official histories acknowledge without dwelling on, and that I think deserves more direct treatment. Blackett's section produced analyses that went beyond the Bay Patrol optimization problem. They produced analyses of bomber allocation, specifically the relative return on strategic investment between heavy bombers directed against German cities and land-based maritime patrol aircraft directed against U-boats in the Bay and the Atlantic. These analyses, using the same kind of quantitative cost-benefit framework that had been applied to the patrol optimization problem, consistently showed that additional maritime patrol aircraft produced a higher return on strategic investment, measured in terms of impact on the Allied war effort, than equivalent investment in heavy bombers. The analyses were provided to the Air Ministry. They were not acted upon. The strategic bombing offensive, championed by Air Marshal Harris and supported by Churchill's direct enthusiasm, continued to receive priority allocation of aircraft production. The Bay of Biscay Patrol received what was left over. Blackett estimated, in a post-war memoir fragment, that the diverted aircraft could have produced approximately 50 to 80 additional U-boat kills in 1942 alone. That figure is speculative. What isn't speculative is that the analysis was done, the conclusion was clear, and the conclusion was overridden by strategic and political considerations that operated outside the reach of quantitative argument. When I was working through the Coastal Command operational research files for this period, I found something in the monthly performance summaries that I think illuminates the relationship between data-driven analysis and the institutional cultures it operates within. The RAF Coastal Command operational reports from 1943 consistently attribute Bay of Biscay's success to improved aircrew skills and tactical proficiency. The language is specific and deliberate. The crews are more skilled, the tactics are better executed, the training has produced results. Blackett's post-war account, and this is drawn from his own published writing rather than from unpublished sources, so it carries the weight of his own public testimony, suggests that this framing was not accidental. He believed that the institutional decision to credit aircrew skill rather than analytical optimization for the improved kill rates was deliberate, a morale management choice that preserved the sense that individual performance was decisive, rather than allowing the men doing the flying to understand that their effectiveness was being systematically managed by a mathematical model running in an office at Northwood. I find this complicated. The institutional reasoning is understandable. The erasure of the analytical contribution from the public record is, in the long history of how this war has been understood, a significant distortion. The U-boat command's tactical response to the Bay Air offensive, the flak-boat experiment, is one of those episodes that demonstrates, with uncomfortable clarity, the difference between a response that is tactically logical within a limited frame and a response that is operationally self-defeating at the broader level. Dönitz, faced with the evidence that aircraft were destroying U-boats in the Bay transit, responded initially by ordering boats to dive immediately upon any aircraft sighting. When the lee light removed the warning interval, he ordered boats to fight on the surface, installing additional anti-aircraft guns, designating certain boats as flak escorts to provide collective air defense during group transits, and directing commanders to engage attacking aircraft rather than dive. The logic, within the specific frame of the aircraft versus U-boat single encounter, had some validity. A Type 7 with a 20mm and a 37mm anti-aircraft gun could damage or destroy an attacking Wellington in the seconds before the depth charges were dropped. Several Allied aircraft were indeed lost to this tactic, but the aggregate result of surfaced U-boats engaging aircraft was, in the monthly kill statistics, negative for the U-boats. A surfaced boat trading anti-aircraft fire with a circling aircraft was more vulnerable, not less, than a diving boat, and the flak boat tactic was abandoned after a brutal sequence of engagements that cost more submarines than it saved. The 62 U-boats sunk in Bay of Biscay transit in the calendar year of 1943 represent the largest geographic concentration of U-boat losses in any single area in any single year of the war. The aircraft hours required to achieve those kills, approximately 187,400 patrol hours, as calculated from the operational records, represent a kill efficiency of one U-boat per roughly 3,000 patrol hours. Blackett's pre-offensive calculation had estimated the existing patrol system was producing kills at approximately 1 per 15,000 patrol hours. The operational research section's optimization work, combined with the new equipment, had improved kill efficiency by a factor of approximately 5. These numbers exist in the operational research files, fully documented, without rhetorical embellishment. They are the mathematics of how a physicist, sitting in an office at Northwood with a calculation sheet and a margin annotation asking the right question, contributed to the destruction of 62 submarines and the deaths of the men who crewed them. The contribution is not the kind that gets depicted in films. It doesn't have the texture of the night attack or the depth charge run. It's a number at the bottom of a page, and a recommendation, and a reallocation of aircraft to different patrol boxes. And the submarines went to the bottom of the bay at 1 per 3,000 hours rather than 1 per 15,000, because a man who understood probability asked why the first number was so small and what it would take to make it larger. The Bay of Biscay at the end of 1943 was a different ocean than it had been at the beginning of 1942. The transit routes that U-boats had crossed with reasonable expectation of survival had become a gauntlet that claimed a consistent percentage of every boat that attempted it. The French Atlantic bases were still operating, the boats were still departing, but the expected operational attrition of the bay crossing had changed the mathematics of a patrol's probability of return. And the men in the boats understood this in the way that men who live close to operational statistics always eventually understand the numbers that govern their situation. The Schnorkel would later change the bay dynamic again. A submerged boat presented a much smaller radar target than a surfaced one, and night surface runs became less common as snorkel-equipped boats avoided the surface entirely when possible. But by the time the Schnorkel was standard equipment, the broader strategic situation had already determined the campaign's outcome. The Bay of Biscay continued killing U-boats until the end of the war. Blackett's calculation sheet, the one from the 3rd of November, 1942, with the 4.7% at the bottom, and the margin annotation asking what it would take to make it useful, was answered. It took mathematics and equipment and the institutional willingness to let the mathematics direct the equipment. The Bay provided the answer in 62 dead submarines.